One day in the mid-6th century BCE in Anshan, located in the southwestern part of the Iranian plateau, a young man inherited the rule of a small vassal kingdom from his father. No grand coronation ceremony was recorded, and no inscription preserved the exact date of this moment. His name in Old Persian may have meant son or been related to shepherds. Scholars have yet to reach a consensus on its etymology. He was called Cyrus, and later generations would refer to him as the Great. Yet, at this starting point, he was merely a local ruler of a peripheral province under the order of the Median Empire. His kingdom did not always appear in the diplomatic correspondence of the great powers of the Near East. This state of neglect, perhaps seen as political marginalization at the time, provided the young ruler with a unique strategic advantage from the hindsight of history. He could gather strength, observe the situation, and wait for the right moment in the blind spot of the great powers. To understand Cyrus's story, one must begin from this unremarkable starting point, rather than tracing backward from the later glory of his empire. The most widely circulated account of Cyrus's origins comes from Herodotus. According to Herodotus, Cyrus was the grandson of the Median king Astyages. The king, having dreamed that his grandson would seize his throne, ordered the infant to be abandoned in the wilderness. A shepherd adopted him, and he grew up among cattle and sheep until a chance event in his youth revealed his royal lineage. This narrative structure was familiar to audiences in the ancient world. Moses placed in a reed basket on the Nile. Sargon of Akkad also claiming to have been set adrift in a river by his mother, and Romulus and Remus of Rome suckled by a she-wolf. Abandoned infant, shepherd, hidden royal identity, and the ultimate revelation of destiny. This was a recurring heroic narrative template in the ancient Near East, whose function was not to record historical facts, but to provide mythological support for the legitimacy of power. Herodotus himself acknowledged that he had heard multiple versions of Cyrus's origins and chose the one he deemed most credible. But most credible does not equate to most accurate. The universality of this narrative pattern itself reminds us that what we may be facing is not historical record, but the literary expression of political myth. Ctesias presents a completely different version. According to Ctesias, Cyrus was not the grandson of Astyages, but came from humble origins, rising through his military talents. However, the credibility of Ctesias' account has long been questioned. Although he served as a royal physician in the Persian court and claimed access to Persian royal archives, his works are filled with dramatic court intrigues and obvious literary embellishments, leading later historians to consistently rate the historical value of his records as low. In Phaseropedia, Xenophon portrays Cyrus as an ideal monarch who received a perfect education from childhood. But the purpose of this work is clearly political philosophy, rather than historical documentation. Xenophon uses the figure of Cyrus to expound Greek political theories about the ideal ruler. 3 Greek authors, 3 different childhoods of Cyrus, with contradictions far outweighing commonalities. This in itself serves as a methodological warning. When attempting to tell the true story of Cyrus, what we first encounter is not facts, but narratives. Each narrative carries the political stance, cultural background, and rhetorical purpose of its narrator. And peeling away these layers to approach historical truth is an exceedingly difficult task. If we temporarily set aside the legendary elements in Greek literature and turn to the indigenous written records of the Near East, Cyrus's family background presents a much more modest picture. In the Cyrus cylinder inscription, Cyrus refers to himself as the son of Cambyses, the great king of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus, the great king of Anshan, and great-grandson of Thespes, the great king of Anshan, tracing a clear patrilineal royal lineage. This inscription, a political text written in Akkadian cuneiform, aimed to assert legitimacy to a Babylonian audience. As such, the presentation of the lineage itself was strategic. It emphasized the continuity and antiquity of the royal line, rather than the sacred or legendary nature of his ancestry. Nevertheless, it points to a fundamental fact. Cyrus was not a self-made hero emerging from the wilderness, but the heir of a local royal family that had persisted for several generations. The Achaemenid family of Anshan had ruled this land for at least 3 generations before Cyrus. This political continuity provided an important foundation for the legitimacy of Cyrus's rule, and meant that he inherited not only the throne, but also a relatively mature political network and governance experience. What exactly was Anshan as a political entity? The answer to this question is more complex than most popular narratives suggest. Located in what is now Iran's Fars province, Anshan lies in a transitional zone between the highlands and lowlands south of the Zagros Mountains. It was once an integral part of the Elamite civilization. During the 2nd millennium BCE, Anshan and Susa served as the 2 core regions of the Elamite kingdom, with King of Anshan and Susa being a common title among Elamite rulers. However, by the early 1st millennium BCE, the political structure of Elam had disintegrated, and Anshan's status as an independent political unit became ambiguous. The Persians, an ethnic group speaking an Indo-European Iranian language, migrated into the region at some point in time that is not entirely clear, gradually replacing the original Elamite ruling class. This process of ethnic replacement likely spanned several centuries, involving various forms of interaction, such as military conquest, cultural integration, and intermarriage. It was against this complex historical backdrop that Cyrus's family established local power. Being both descendants of conquerors and inheritors of the historical traditions of this land. We must pause here to examine a methodological issue. Our knowledge of the kingdom of Anshan before the rise of Cyrus is extremely limited, and this lack of knowledge must be honestly acknowledged. In the extant cuneiform archives, the Achaemenid rulers of Anshan left almost no independent administrative documents or inscriptions. Our information about them primarily comes from later retrospective genealogical claims made by Cyrus himself and his successors, as well as scattered indirect references in Babylonian and Assyrian texts. This means that when we describe Cyrus inheriting a vassal kingdom, the chain of evidence supporting this judgment is fragile. The political structure, economic foundation, military strength, and relations with neighboring peoples of Anshan, background information crucial to understanding Cyrus's rise, largely lie in the blind spots of historical records. This scarcity of sources is not accidental. It reflects Anshan's marginal status in the political landscape of the time. A small kingdom that did not attract the interest of the historians of great powers, and whose internal affairs were naturally not preserved in detail in imperial archives. Nevertheless, a broader political framework is relatively clear. Anshan was under the hegemony of the Median Empire when Cyrus ascended to the throne. Media was a powerful state that rose in the northwestern Iranian plateau in the late 7th century BCE, with its capital Ecbatana, located in present-day Hamadan, Iran. In 612 BCE, Media allied with the Neo-Babylonian Empire to destroy the Assyrian Empire and subsequently divided its legacy. Media gained vast territories across the Iranian plateau and eastern Anatolia. Within this framework, the Persian rulers of Anshan were vassals of Media, a fact indirectly corroborated by multiple historical sources. However, the specific meaning of vassal requires careful interpretation. It may have entailed regular tribute, military conscription obligations, and subordination in foreign policy. but it likely also retained a considerable degree of internal autonomy. The Median Empire's mode of governance appears to have resembled a hegemonic system rather than direct administrative control, with local rulers maintaining significant autonomy while acknowledging suzerain authority. We lack sufficient evidence to precisely define how stringent the subordination between Anshan and Media was. But this ambiguity itself may have provided Cyrus with room for maneuver in his later actions. In the mid-6th century BCE, the Near East was a world of multiple, coexisting powers. The Medes controlled most of the Iranian plateau. The Neo-Babylonian Empire ruled the heartland of Mesopotamia, with the city of Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar II, standing as one of the most magnificent metropolises of its time. The kingdom of Lydia occupied western Anatolia. Its king Croesus, renowned for his astonishing wealth and said to be the first ruler to mint gold coins. And along the Nile, Egypt's 26th dynasty maintained the final independent glory of the Pharaonic era, with Psamtik-I's reforms restoring Egypt as a significant force in the eastern Mediterranean. Among these four major powers existed a complex web of diplomacy, marriages, treaties, and exchanges of envoys, creating a relatively stable balance of power. The Persians of Anshan were nearly invisible on this grand chessboard. There is no evidence that the courts of Babylon or Lydia regarded Anshan as a political force to be taken seriously. Before the 550s BCE, it was precisely this state of neglect that Cyrus was about to change, and his success would completely shatter this seemingly stable multipolar order. In a world surrounded by great powers, what kind of life did the peaceful Persians lead? Archaeological evidence provides fragmented clues. Sites in the Fars region indicate that the Persians were already engaged in a mixed economy of agriculture and animal husbandry during this period, with horses holding significant importance in their society. Later Greek historical sources repeatedly mention that the three pillars of Persian aristocratic education were riding horses, shooting arrows, and speaking the truth. Although this description may have been idealized, the emphasis on horsemanship and archery aligns with the lifestyle of a semi-nomadic society. Persian social structure appears to have been based on tribes and clans as fundamental units, with the Achaemenid family being the most prominent among them. Though not the sole center of power, Herodotus listed 10 Persian tribes, with the Pasargadae tribe occupying the foremost position, and the Achaemenid clan belonged to this tribe. This tribal confederation style social structure may explain why Cyrus's later rise to power required not only royal lineage, but also the establishment of sufficient consensus and support among tribal elites. The legitimacy of power derived not only from hereditary lineage, but also from political balance and interest coordination within the tribal confederation. Cyrus ascended to the throne of Anshan around 559 BC. His father, Cambyses, not to be confused with Cyrus' later son. Cambyses II remains an almost entirely obscure figure in historical records. We know virtually nothing about the duration of his reign, his policy orientations, or the specifics of his relationship with the Median court. Herodotus claims that Cambyses married the Median princess Mandane, daughter of Astyages, making Cyrus a grandson of the Median royal family. If true, this marital alliance held significant political implications. It meant there existed a blood tie between the Anshan royal house and the Median monarchy, framing Cyrus's later challenge to Media as an internal dynastic power struggle rather than a purely external conquest. However, this account of the marriage relies primarily on Herodotus's singular narrative and is closely intertwined with the legend of Cyrus's abandonment as an infant, making its historical reliability reasonably subject to caution. More importantly, even if such a marriage did occur, it reflected the subordinate status of the Anshan royal house within the Median system. Securing political protection through marriage was a common diplomatic strategy for smaller states. But such a strategy inherently implied an imbalance of power. Regardless of the details of the family lineage, one thing is certain. At the time of his ascension, Cyrus faced a structurally subordinate position. Anshan was part of the Median order, not a challenger to it. Yet, the paradox of history lies in the fact that this very subordination provided Cyrus with a certain strategic advantage. As a participant within the Median system, he had the potential to understand its workings, its weaknesses, and its internal discontent and fractures. A completely external conqueror would need to breach the walls first, while an internal defector only needed to find the right cracks. Cyrus may have been searching for these cracks from the very beginning of his reign. Or perhaps it took him years to form a clear intention of rebellion. We cannot know. Historical records fall silent here. All we can be certain of is the outcome within less than a decade of his ascension. The young ruler of this vassal kingdom would challenge his suzerain, and the power dynamics of the entire Near East would be permanently reshaped as a result. This shift from the periphery to the center was not merely a reversal of personal fate, but the beginning of a profound structural transformation in the course of history. In Ecbatana around 553 BCE, the winter snow had yet to melt when news from the southern region of Anshan traveled northward along the postal roads crossing the Zagros Mountains. Cyrus, the nominal vassal grandson of the Median king Astyages, had openly refused to continue paying tribute to Ecbatana. This was not a mere border skirmish, nor a dispute that could be resolved through diplomatic mediation. For Astyages, who had ruled the northwestern Iranian plateau for over 3 decades, this meant that the entire tributary system he had maintained was beginning to fracture from its southernmost edge. The palace complex of Ecbatana stood on a plateau, nearly 2,000 meters above sea level. According to Herodotus, it was surrounded by 7 layers of colorful walls, forming a spectacular fortification that served as the most symbolic material embodiment of Median royal authority. Yet, the strength of walls could never replace the stability of political loyalty. And at this moment, loyalty was precisely what Astyages lacked the most. This once awe-inspiring capital now faced the most severe political crisis since its founding. The atmosphere within the court grew exceptionally tense, with ministers whispering in the corridors, while Astyages, seated on his throne, was forced to contemplate a question he had never before considered: how to deal with an enemy bound by blood, yet already in betrayal. To understand why this rebellion could occur, one must first grasp the actual structure of Median hegemony. Media was not a centralized empire with a mature bureaucratic system. It was more akin to a loose hegemonic alliance maintained through military deterrence and tributary relationships. Astyages' power base lay in his control over the military aristocracy of the core Median tribes and the fear this control instilled in the surrounding vassal states. Yet this structure was inherently fragile. When cracks appeared in the central authority's deterrence, centrifugal forces at the periphery rapidly intensified. Cyrus's Anshan was not an insignificant minor state. It possessed an independent royal lineage, a substantial population base, and a vast strategic depth stretching from the southern slopes of the Zagros Mountains to the Persian Gulf. In other words, the largest vassal within the Median hegemonic system was precisely the one most capable of challenging it. More importantly, the Persian tribes in the Anshan region maintained relatively independent military traditions and social organizations. Their submission to Media was based more on the balance of power than on cultural identification. This form of rule, grounded in power equilibrium rather than institutional integration, was inherently fragile. When the balance of power shifted, political loyalties would inevitably follow suit. According to Herodotus, upon learning of Cyrus's rebellion, Astyages first dispatched a general named Harpagus to lead an army south to suppress the revolt. This name carries an extremely dramatic backstory in Herodotus's narrative. Harpagus was said to be the courtier who, years earlier, had been ordered by Astyages to kill the infant Cyrus, but secretly handed the child over to a shepherd to raise. When Astyages later discovered the truth, he took revenge by serving Harpagus's own son at a horrifying banquet after having him cooked. This narrative is highly literary, and scholars have strong doubts about the credibility of its details. However, the political logic Herodotus attempts to convey through this story is noteworthy. Astyages sent precisely someone who harbored deep resentment toward him, and this person made a predictable choice on the battlefield. Regardless of the authenticity of this revenge tale, it at least reflects the tense state of relations within the Median court. If a ruler must rely on potentially hostile generals to maintain his authority, it indicates that his political foundation is already quite weak. Harpagus' appointment may have been Astyages' reluctant choice in a situation of scarce talent. After the Median army led by Harpagus made contact with Cyrus's Persian forces, a large-scale defection occurred. According to Herodotus's account, a significant portion of the Median soldiers voluntarily switched to Cyrus's side, while others fled in disarray on the battlefield. This account constitutes the most critical turning point in the narrative of the Median downfall. Yet, it is also the most difficult to independently verify. We currently have no Median documentary records to corroborate or refute this claim. The Phainabonides Chronicle Phay from Babylon provides an extremely valuable piece of circumstantial evidence, documenting the conflict between Cyrus and I-Phaetumegu, the Akkadian name for Astyages, and mentioning that I-Phaetumegu's army rebelled and handed him over to Cyrus. This third-party cuneiform record, at least regarding the core fact of army defection, forms a cross-civilizational corroboration with Herodotus's Greek narrative. It is worth noting that the Babylonian chronicler, as a contemporary observer, focused on this event primarily due to geopolitical considerations. Changes in the power dynamics of the Iranian plateau directly impacted the security of Mesopotamia. Such third-party perspectives often offer more objective and credible records than narratives from the involved parties. However, the term defection itself obscures a multitude of questions we cannot answer. Did the defection occur spontaneously on the battlefield, or was it premeditated through secret communication and planning? Had Harpagus already reached some agreement with Cyrus before setting out on the campaign? Herodotus leans toward the latter, describing how Harpagus contacted Cyrus by hiding a secret message inside a rabbit, his belly. The authenticity of this detail is unverifiable. But the political landscape it implies, widespread discontent within the Median ruling class toward Astyages, which Cyrus's side had consciously exploited before the war broke out, is logically plausible. The collapse of a hegemonic system rarely results solely from external military strikes. More often, it is due to internal political fissures being precisely pried open by external forces. From this perspective, Cyrus's victory was not merely a demonstration of military prowess, but also a result of political wisdom. He successfully transformed a war of external conquest into an internal political revolution within Media, a strategy repeatedly employed during the expansion of the later Persian Empire. Dividing enemies, securing internal allies, and exploiting existing contradictions proved more efficient and enduring than mere military conquest. It is necessary here to pause the narrative and examine the foundation of the historical sources we rely on. Regarding the entire course of the Median-Persian War, the only detailed narrative source that survives is almost exclusively Herodotus. Although the Phainabonides Chronicle, Phay provides crucial independent corroboration, its account is extremely brief, summarizing the entire conflict in just a few lines of cuneiform text, with no elaboration on the process, scale, or duration of the war. Ctesias also recorded this history, but his version significantly contradicts Herodotus, and his work survives only in fragments through later excerpts, severely lacking in completeness. This means that our understanding of this war, which reshaped the power dynamics of the Iranian plateau, is largely shaped by the narrative framework of a Greek historian who lived nearly a century after the events. This is not to deny the value of Herodotus, but to soberly recognize that his account is both our most important window and our greatest limitation. Further complicating matters, Herodotus's sources were primarily oral traditions and travel accounts, materials that inevitably underwent distortion and embellishment during transmission. Therefore, when utilizing these historical sources, we must consistently maintain a critical mindset, distinguishing between what may be historical facts and what constitutes later literary elaboration. After the defection of his frontline army, Astyages did not surrender immediately. According to Herodotus, he hastily assembled a second army, composed of veterans and youths in Ecbatana, and personally led them into battle. If this detail is accurate, it suggests that the Median monarchy still retained some mobilization capacity in its core regions, and Astyages was not a ruler who simply awaited his fate. However, this hastily formed army was clearly no match for Cyrus's forces, which had absorbed a large number of defecting Median troops. The outcome of the second battle was the capture of Astyages and the opening of Ecbatana's gates. The Nabonidus Chronicle records this outcome with similar brevity and coldness. Cyrus seized silver, gold, and other valuables and transported them back to Anshan. A hegemony that had lasted for decades came to an end in less than 3 years. This rapid transfer of power reflects an important characteristic of the political structure in the ancient Near East. The personalized system of monarchy often lacked sufficient institutional resilience in times of crisis. When the central figure lost military support, the entire political edifice would quickly collapse. Astyages' final resistance was more like an elegy for an era than a truly effective military action. How Cyrus treated Astyages after his victory provides an important clue to understanding the nature of the new regime. Herodotus records that Cyrus did not execute his defeated grandfather, but kept him close, granting him a certain degree of dignified treatment. Ctesias offers a different version, claiming that Astyages was appointed as the governor of a remote region. However, Ctesias's credibility has long been questioned by scholars, as his descriptions of Persian court affairs often exhibit a clear tendency toward dramatization. Regardless of the specific details, the fact that Cyrus did not kill Astyages is consistent across multiple sources. This choice may have stemmed from considerations of kinship or political pragmatism. A well-treated former ruler was more effective in placating the sentiments of the Median nobility than a martyred executed one. From a broader historical perspective, this policy of tolerance became a significant feature of the later Persian Empire's governance model. Unlike the brutal conquests of the Assyrian Empire, the Persians preferred to achieve their rule through political integration rather than cultural eradication. This strategy not only reduced the cost of governance, but also laid the foundation for the empire's long-term stability. This leads to the core debate regarding the nature of the regime after the fall of Media. Did Cyrus establish a completely new Persian empire that replaced Media, or a Persian-Median joint regime that restructured power within the existing framework of Media? Scholars supporting the latter point to several key pieces of evidence. In the later administrative system of the Persian Empire, the Medians consistently held the second highest status. Just below the Persians, Ecbatana was not destroyed, but instead became one of the summer capitals of the Persian Empire, with its administrative functions preserved. Greek historical sources often conflated Persians and Medians, even using the term Medians to refer to the entire Persian Empire, a practice that persisted until the Greco-Persian Wars. These signs suggest that Cyrus's victory may have been closer to a power transition within a hegemonic system rather than a complete civilizational replacement. Archaeological evidence shows that the material culture of the Median region did not undergo a disruptive change after the Persian conquest, further supporting the interpretation of political integration rather than cultural conquest. Persian rulers appear to have consciously maintained the continuity of Median traditions to gain the recognition and cooperation of the ruled. However, some scholars have cautiously challenged the notion of power consolidation. They argue that the high status of the Medes within the empire likely reflected Cyrus's pragmatic strategy of appeasing a large conquered population rather than genuine power sharing. The Persian royal family always firmly held the highest decision-making authority, and the lineage of the Achaemenid dynasty was never open to Median nobility. The appearance of a so-called joint governance might merely have been a carefully maintained political facade by the conquerors to reduce the costs of rule. This debate remains unresolved to this day, partly due to the lack of sufficient administrative documents from the Median perspective to determine the actual extent of power held by Median elites within the new regime. Silent archives sometimes speak louder than clamorous narratives. The deeper issue lies in our extremely limited understanding of Median social structure and political institutions. In the absence of adequate historical records, any judgment regarding the degree of power sharing remains highly speculative. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the two extreme views. Cyrus was neither a simple conqueror nor an equal partner, but a pragmatic ruler skilled at leveraging existing political resources. Regardless of how academia defines the nature of this power shift, its geopolitical consequences are clear. By around 550 BCE, Cyrus had gained control over the core regions of the entire Iranian plateau, from the ancestral Persian lands of Anshan to the Median heartland of Ecbatana. An unprecedented unified power on the plateau had taken shape. This regime inherited the Median claims of suzerainty over surrounding regions while possessing a far greater capacity for resource integration than the Median era had ever achieved. To the west, the wealthy kingdom of Lydia and the Neo-Babylonian Empire on the Mesopotamian plain watched the rise of this emerging power. To the east, the vast expanse of the Central Asian steppes remained effectively uncontrolled by any single regime. Standing on the walls of Ecbatana, Cyrus saw before him not only a conquered capital, but also a blank map waiting to be filled. His gaze would next turn westward, where an equally ambitious king was planning his own eastward expansion. This shift in the geopolitical landscape not only altered the internal order of the Iranian plateau, but also redefined the balance of power across the entire ancient Near East. A new imperial era was about to begin, and Cyrus would become one of its most important architects. In a sense, the fall of Media marked the arrival of a significant turning point in the political history of the ancient Near East. In the late autumn of 547 BC, the city of Sardis in west-central Anatolia remained enveloped in a sense of unwavering security. The capital of the kingdom of Lydia was perched on a ridge south of the Hermus River Valley, with steep cliffs on three sides forming a natural barrier. Within its walls, the treasury held the alluvial gold from the Pactolus River, the very gold that had enabled Lydia to become the first nation in the Mediterranean world to mint standardized gold and silver coins. Below the city walls, merchant caravans traveled along the road, leading to the Aegean coast, while Greek traders, Phoenician artisans, and Phrygian herders mingled in the bustling markets. No one could have foreseen that an army from the distant Iranian plateau would arrive at the city gates by winter. The fall of this city would propel a Persian regime, once confined to the heart of the plateau, to the very threshold of the Aegean Sea. The cause of the war as recounted by Herodotus, is given a highly dramatic beginning. According to Herodotus, before deciding whether to attack Persia, King Croesus of Lydia sent messengers to the oracle of Delphi to consult the god Apollo. The oracle's response was, if Croesus crossed the Halys River and launched an attack, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus interpreted this as a promise of victory, never imagining that the empire to be destroyed might be his own. This story is so finely crafted that it contains nearly all the elements of a Greek tragedy: arrogance, misinterpretation, and the reversal of fate. Whether it actually happened is beyond verification, but its function in Herodotus's narrative is clear. It explains the fall of Lydia as divine punishment for human hubris, rather than mere military defeat. When using this account, we must recognize that it is, first and foremost, a Greek moral allegory, and only secondarily a potential historical clue. Croesus was not a reckless man. Under his rule, the kingdom of Lydia was the most powerful political entity in western Anatolia, controlling a vast region from the inland plateau to the Ionian coast. Greek city-states such as Ephesus and Miletus had successively submitted to Lydia's suzerainty, and Croesus himself enjoyed immense prestige in the Greek world for his generous donations to major Greek temples. His wealth was nearly legendary in the ancient Mediterranean world. However, wealth does not automatically translate into military advantage. Croesus chose to advance eastward, crossing the Halys River into the region of Cappadocia. According to Herodotus's explanation, the motivations behind this decision included both vigilance towards Cyrus's rise and a desire to avenge his kinsman Astyages. Yet, the arrangement of these motivations itself reflects Herodotus's narrative preference. He tended to attribute wars to personal emotions and misinterpretations of oracles rather than structural geopolitical pressures. A more plausible scenario is that after Cyrus annexed Media, the buffer zone along Lydia's eastern border had vanished. Croesus was now facing a rapidly expanding new power, and a preemptive strike might have seemed the least bad option available to him. The two armies first clashed in the region of Darya in Cappadocia. According to Herodotus, the battle lasted an entire day, with neither side achieving a decisive victory, and both withdrew after nightfall. Croesus then made a decision that would later prove fatal, believing his forces were insufficient to continue fighting far from home. He led his army back to Sardis, disbanded some of his allied troops, and planned to reassemble a larger coalition in the following spring. He had already sent requests for alliances to Pharaoh Amasis of Egypt, Nabonidus of Babylon, and Sparta. This decision was based on a reasonable military principle. Large-scale battles in the ancient Near East typically took place in spring and summer, with winter campaigns considered extremely risky. Croesus had every reason to believe that Cyrus would follow this convention. He was wrong. Cyrus did not wait for spring. He led his army in pursuit of Croesus, crossing the heartland of Anatolia at an astonishing speed, and arriving at the plains outside Sardis before Croesus could complete the reassembly of his allied forces. This winter march itself was a disruption of conventional military rhythms. In describing the subsequent Battle of the Sardis Plains, Herodotus provides a famous tactical detail. Cyrus positioned baggage camels at the front of his formation, using their scent to spook and disrupt the proud cavalry horses of Lydia, thereby neutralizing Croesus's most formidable troops. This detail is vivid and specific, yet precisely because it is so ingenious, it raises suspicion. Camels were indeed used as transport animals in ancient Near Eastern armies, but their systematic deployment as an anti-cavalry tactic lacks parallel records in other historical sources. We cannot rule out that this was a folktale adopted by Herodotus to explain the Persian victory, nor can we confirm that it actually occurred. The only certainty is the outcome. The Lydian cavalry was routed, and Croesus was forced to retreat into the city of Sardis. The fall of Sardis is also shrouded in legendary narratives. According to Herodotus, the siege lasted only 14 days. The breach of the city's defenses is said to have resulted from a chance event. A Persian soldier observed a Lydian defender climbing down a steep cliff to retrieve a dropped helmet, thereby discovering an unguarded climbing path on the cliff face. Persian commandos subsequently scaled the walls along this route, leading to the capture of Sardis. This story bears a striking resemblance to the recurring narrative motif in later Greek historical accounts of a weak point in the wall being discovered by chance, suggesting it may be a literary trope rather than an accurate record of specific military actions. However, it is undisputed that Sardis fell within a short period. The fact that a city considered nearly impregnable changed hands in less than 2 weeks indicates that Lydia's defensive system had completely collapsed in the face of Cyrus's winter offensive. The ultimate fate of Croesus stands as one of the most dramatically compelling passages in Herodotus' narrative. According to Herodotus, after being captured, Croesus was placed on a pyre to be burned alive. As the flames rose, he cried out the name of Solon, the Athenian sage, who had once warned him that no one could be called happy until their life had ended. Moved by this, Cyrus ordered the fire to be extinguished, ultimately sparing Croesus and keeping him as an advisor. The moral lesson of this story is so perfectly crafted that it is unlikely to be a faithful record of historical events. In fact, a fragment of a Babylonian cuneiform chronicle appears to suggest that Croesus may have been executed shortly after the fall of Sardis. Though the interpretation of this damaged and incomplete text remains highly contentious, with scholars still divided over the meaning of key terms. We are thus confronted with 2 starkly different narratives, one portraying Cyrus as a merciful conqueror, the other pointing toward a far more ruthless conclusion. Perhaps the truth can never be fully recovered. It is necessary here to pause the narrative and examine the historical sources we rely upon. Nearly all the detailed accounts of the Lydian War, the Delphic Oracle, the camel tactics, the cliffside ascent, the funeral pyre, come almost exclusively from Herodotus, who wrote nearly a century after the events occurred. His sources likely included local Lydian oral traditions, archives of the Delphic priests, and stories circulating in the Persian court. Yet these sources themselves had undergone decades of transmission and transformation. No indigenous written records from Lydia remain to offer a contrasting perspective. On the Persian side, the Cyrus cylinder and other Achaemenid inscriptions barely mention the Lydian War, a notable silence in itself. This may be because the inscriptions were primarily intended for a Babylonian audience, or perhaps because the conquest of Lydia did not hold a central place in the Persian official narrative that we might assume. In any case, our understanding of this war is largely viewed through Greek eyes, and the Greeks had their own narrative needs and moral frameworks. After the fall of Sardis, Cyrus himself did not remain in Asia Minor for long. According to Herodotus, he left the aftermath to his generals and led the main force back east, likely to address urgent matters in other parts of the empire. However, the fall of Sardis triggered a chain reaction along the western coast of Asia Minor. Most of the Greek city-states in Ionia, Aeolia, and Caria had previously been under the suzerainty of Lydia. While Croesus's rule meant subordination for them, it also provided a relatively stable political framework. Now, this framework had suddenly collapsed. According to Herodotus, most Greek city-states had attempted to remain neutral before the war, and some even sent envoys after Cyrus's victory, expressing willingness to accept the same terms as they had under Lydia. Cyrus refused. He replied to these envoys with a parable. A fisherman played the flute to the fish, but the fish refused to dance Only when the fisherman cast his net and caught them did the fish leap in the net. The fisherman said, "Now it is too late to dance." Whether this parable originated from Cyrus himself is unverifiable, but the political message it conveyed was clear. City-states that did not take sides before the war could not expect favorable treatment afterward. The subsequent conquest was led by Harpagus, a general under Cyrus. According to Herodotus, this commander was the very figure who had assisted Cyrus in subverting the army of Astyages at the Median court. He led his forces along the western coast of Asia Minor, capturing Greek city-states one by one. Resistance did occur, but it was limited in scale and fragmented. The Phocaeans chose the most extreme response. The entire population boarded ships, abandoned their homeland, and migrated to the western Mediterranean, eventually establishing a new colony near Corsica. This was a desperate act of free choice. Most city-states lacked the Phocaeans' resolve or the naval capacity to undertake such a large-scale migration. After their resistance failed, they accepted Persian rule. Harpagus' conquest likely lasted several years, though the exact timeline remains unclear in historical records. By the mid-540s BCE, the Greek city-states of Asia Minor had largely been incorporated into the Persian administrative framework. These city-states, which had once only faced Lydia, a semi-Hellenized neighbor, now found themselves as peripheral provinces of a vast empire spanning the entire Near East. The consequences of the Lydian War extended far beyond the fall of a single kingdom. Geopolitically, it accomplished three major outcomes. First, the Persian sphere of influence expanded from the Iranian plateau to the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, eliminating any buffer political entities between Persia and mainland Greece. Second, the Greek city-states in Asia Minor were incorporated into the Persian system, and the accumulated grievances within these cities would erupt half a century later in the form of the Ionian Revolt, ultimately igniting the fuse of the Greco-Persian Wars. Third, Lydia's wealth, particularly its advanced monetary economy and trade networks, was inherited by Persia, providing crucial economic infrastructure for the empire's subsequent westward expansion and administrative operations. Cyrus may not have fully grasped the long-term implications of the second point. His governance model in Asia Minor, appointing Persian satraps while retaining some power for local elites, was largely consistent with his approach in other conquered regions. However, there existed a deep structural tension between the political culture of the Greek city-states and the monarchical systems of the Near East, a tension that would not dissipate despite the flexibility of administrative arrangements. From a broader perspective, the fall of Lydia marked a crucial qualitative shift in Cyrus's conquests. Prior to this, his victories over Media and the consolidation of the Iranian plateau occurred within a relatively homogeneous cultural sphere, where Persians and Medes shared linguistic roots, religious traditions, and political customs. However, Lydia and the Greek city-states of Asia Minor belonged to entirely different civilizational spheres. From this point on, Cyrus's empire was no longer merely a reorganization of hegemony within the Iranian plateau, but a trans-civilizational polity that had to manage multiple languages, religions, and political traditions simultaneously. The governance challenges arising from this transformation would persist throughout the entire history of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus's next target after Lydia, Babylon, would elevate the complexity of this cross-civilizational governance to an even greater magnitude. The fall of Sardis was not an endpoint, but the opening of a door. On the other side lay an ancient, intricate, and far more untamable Near Eastern world, far older and more complex than the Iranian plateau. Around 546 BC, before the ashes of Sardis had cooled, Cyrus had already turned his gaze eastward. East of Pasargadae stretched a vast expanse that, to Greek historians, was nearly synonymous with the ends of the earth. The arid steppes of Parthia, the river valley oases of Bactria, the desert fringes of Khwarezm, and the vaguely named towns along the Sogdian trade routes beyond. During the era of Median hegemony, these regions may have maintained some loose political connection with the Iranian plateau. But the precise nature of this connection, whether it was direct rule, a tributary relationship, or merely a tacit understanding based on cultural affinity, remains largely unclear. What is certain is that, after defeating Astyages and annexing Lydia, Cyrus faced an urgent strategic question: where did his eastern border lie? Or, more precisely, did he even possess an eastern line of defense that could be called a border? The answer to this question would determine whether all his achievements on the Western Front could be sustained in the long term. Geographically, the eastern part of the Iranian plateau lacked natural barriers, although the Hindu Kush mountains were formidable. Their river valleys provided convenient seasonal migration routes for nomadic peoples. More importantly, the political vacuum in these regions itself posed a threat. Any ambitious local strongman could gather forces there, biding their time to strike westward. The timeline of Cyrus's eastern campaigns into Central Asia is frustratingly sparse in the surviving historical records. After recounting the Lydian War, Herodotus mentions that Cyrus subdued every nation without exception, then abruptly shifts the narrative to the Babylonian campaign, compressing what may have been 6 to 7 years of eastern conquests into a single sweeping statement. This omission is not due to Herodotus's oversight. His sources were primarily Greeks from Asia Minor and the oral traditions of the Persian court, and military operations deep in Central Asia were too remote for either of these circles. Ctesias, likewise, fails to fill this gap. His accounts of Cyrus's eastern campaigns are fragmented and filled with details that contradict Herodotus, casting long-standing doubt on their reliability. We are left with a period of history that was nearly simultaneously overlooked by both major Greek historians. This scarcity of sources reflects the geographical limitations of information dissemination in the ancient world. Central Asia, far removed from the Mediterranean sphere, saw its political events rarely enter the purview of Greek historians. Even when merchants or diplomatic envoys occasionally brought back fragments of information, these pieces often became distorted in transmission and were ultimately deemed unreliable and discarded by historians. Can archaeology and Near Eastern texts compensate for the silence of Greek historical sources? The answer is, only to a very limited extent. Unlike regions such as Babylon, which possess rich cuneiform archives, Central Asia in the 6th century BCE had a far less developed writing tradition. Alternatively, even if some form of record-keeping system existed, it has not survived the harsh climatic conditions of this land. Although archaeological excavations in Bactria have revealed architectural remains and administrative traces from the Achaemenid period, most of this material evidence can only confirm that Persian rule was established at some point without revealing how it came to be. The ruins of a building with Persian-style column capitals might indicate forced transformation following military conquest. Or they could signify the local elite voluntarily adopting the architectural norms of the suzerain state to demonstrate loyalty. Material remains are silent. They answer, what, but not how, or when. More troubling is the fact that archaeological work in Central Asia itself faces numerous limitations. Political instability, funding shortages, and technical constraints have prevented systematic excavation of many important sites to this day. We may never know how many crucial pieces of evidence remain buried beneath untouched layers of soil. Nevertheless, scholars have attempted to piece together a rough picture from the limited clues available. A widely accepted, though far from conclusive, reconstruction suggests that after conquering Lydia and before attacking Babylon, Cyrus led his army eastward, successively incorporating Parthia, Arya, Drangiana, Arachosia, Bactria, Sogdia, and Chorasmia into his empire. The primary basis for this conquest list is not contemporary documents from Cyrus's era, but rather the list of imperial provinces recorded by Darius I in the Behistun inscription. The logic being that since Darius inherited these territories and did not claim to have conquered them himself, they were likely incorporated into the empire during the reigns of Cyrus or Cambyses. This line of reasoning is plausible, but each step involves assumptions. Perhaps some of these regions were conquered by Cambyses rather than Cyrus. Perhaps others were never truly conquered, but instead chose nominal submission as the empire expanded. The situation is further complicated by the possibility that some regions experience cycles of conquest and rebellion, with their eventual incorporation into the empire being far more complex than a single military campaign. The Behistun inscription itself records the large-scale rebellions Darius faced early in his reign, suggesting that imperial control over frontier regions was far more fragile than it appeared on the surface. It is necessary to pause here to examine a methodological question. When we speak of conquest in 6th century BCE Central Asia, what exactly does this term mean? In Mesopotamia or Anatolia, conquest typically meant capturing cities, taking over administrative systems, and replacing or co-opting local rulers, actions that left behind written records, architectural modifications, and material cultural discontinuities. However, in many parts of Central Asia, settled cities were sparse, and the political organization of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples was fluid and decentralized. What is termed conquest here likely resembled a hybrid process of negotiations, deterrence, marriages, and localized conflicts. The outcome was not a clear demarcation, but rather a gradient of influence that gradually diminished from the core to the periphery. Applying modern concepts of state territorial sovereignty to understand the eastern frontiers of the Achaemenid Empire is almost certain to be misleading. The empire's boundaries here were not a line but a broad, constantly shifting gray zone. In such a context, conquest might have merely meant that local tribal chieftains acknowledged the suzerainty of the Persian king, agreeing to provide military assistance and symbolic tribute when needed. Such loose political ties might have sufficed to maintain stability during peacetime, but their fragility would become immediately apparent once turmoil arose at the imperial center. In this gray area, the status of Bactria warrants separate discussion. This river valley region, centered on what is now northern Afghanistan, possessed the rare foundation of irrigated agriculture and a relatively dense settled population in Central Asia, serving as a crucial hub connecting the Iranian plateau with the Central Asian steppes. In the later Achaemenid administrative system, the satrap of Bactria was often a close relative of the royal family, hinting at the region's special significance within the empire. Did Cyrus personally lead his army into Bactria? There is reason to speculate that the answer is affirmative. Such an important strategic node was likely not secured through diplomatic means alone. However, speculation remains speculation. We have no documents explicitly recording Cyrus himself setting foot on Bactrian soil, nor any archaeological sites that can be definitively linked to his eastern military campaigns. Bactria's geographical location made it key to controlling Central Asia, with the Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus River, providing a stable water source for the region, while the mineral resources of the surrounding mountains, particularly lapis lazuli, added to its economic value. If Cyrus did indeed conquer Bactria, it was likely a complex military operation spanning several months, involving the successive capture of multiple river valley oases. The situation regarding Sogdiana and Khwarezm is even more ambiguous, centered around Samarkand, The Sogdian region was one of the most important commercial network hubs in Central Asia, with Sogdian merchants later playing a pivotal role in Silk Road trade. However, in the 6th century BCE, the scale and organization of this commercial network remain unclear. Khwarezm, located in the delta region of the lower Amu Darya, was listed by Herodotus as one of the tribute-paying peoples of the Persian Empire, though his geographical understanding of the area was evidently flawed. There is no consensus among scholars as to whether these regions were incorporated into the empire during the time of Cyrus, or were formally integrated later under Darius. Some scholars point out that Khwarezm appears in the list of provinces in Darius's Behistun inscription, but not in the tribute list, a discrepancy that may suggest the region's relationship with the imperial center varied over time. Yet the word may here carries too much interpretive weight. The situation in Sogdiana was likely even more complex, as the region's tradition of city-states meant the Persians faced not a single political entity, but a series of local powers that had to be dealt with individually. Each oasis city likely had its own rulers and defensive systems, making the conquest process a protracted city-by-city endeavor. If we temporarily set aside the specific regional investigations and instead examine Cyrus's eastward expansion from the macro-level perspective of imperial strategy, a more fundamental question emerges. Why did he turn east? The western front of Lydia already offered abundant wealth and access to the Aegean Sea, while the southern front of Babylon, the wealthiest center of civilization in the Near East, was clearly a more attractive target. In such a context, what was the strategic motivation behind spending years penetrating the sparsely populated and resource-limited regions of Central Asia? One explanation is security-driven. The persistent threat posed by Central Asian nomads to the eastern Iranian plateau forced Cyrus to stabilize his rear before attacking Babylon. Another explanation emphasizes economic factors. The lapis lazuli and turquoise trade routes of Central Asia, along with the agricultural output of Bactria, were not insignificant to the empire. Both explanations are plausible, yet neither can be fully substantiated by existing evidence. Perhaps the true motivation was a combination of multiple factors, possibly including personal ambition or dynastic political considerations that cannot be gleaned from historical records. From a military perspective, controlling Central Asia also meant gaining access to high-quality war horses and cavalry resources, which held significant importance for an empire whose military strength relied heavily on cavalry. Furthermore, the eastward expansion may have been linked to the internal political balance within the Persian royal family. The wealth and prestige gained through military conquests helped solidify Cyrus's standing among the nobility. It is noteworthy, or more accurately, it is worth honestly acknowledging, that our narrative of this history is largely constrained by a structural bias. The surviving historical materials almost entirely originate from the perspective of the conquerors or their successors. The voices of the conquered peoples of Central Asia are nearly entirely absent from the historical record. How did the Parthians, Bactrians, and Sogdians view the arrival of Persian power? Were there those among them who welcomed this new order, who resisted fiercely, or who were forced to migrate or lost their lands during the conquest? These questions are not without answers, but we simply lack the material foundation to even ask them. The regions, reduced to mere place names, in the lists of Persian provinces, were once home to complete communities with their own languages, beliefs, and political traditions. Their historical experiences were swallowed by the grand framework of imperial narratives, which in itself represents a cognitive gap that must be acknowledged. We can only imagine what the Persian conquest meant to a Bactrian farmer or a Sogdian merchant: changes in tax burdens, adjustments to trade rules, interference in religious practices, or merely a change in the ruler's name. These micro, level historical experiences are precisely the key to understanding the true impact of conquest. Yet, they remain almost entirely beyond our grasp. From the perspective of imperial administration, the management of the eastern territories during Cyrus's era is similarly shrouded in uncertainty. The satrapal system, later established by Darius, dividing the empire into provinces, each overseen by a satrap responsible for taxation, justice, and military affairs, is often regarded as a hallmark institutional innovation of the Achaemenid Empire. However, did this system already exist in embryonic form during Cyrus's time? Did Cyrus appoint local agents akin to satraps across Central Asia? Or did he rely more on the loyalty pledges of local tribal chieftains? A few clues suggest that Cyrus may have adopted a flexible strategy tailored to local conditions, establishing direct administrative bodies in regions with a stronger administrative foundation while settling for nominal suzerainty in areas dominated by tribal societies. Yet, this reconstruction is largely based on retrospective reasoning from later institutions rather than direct evidence from the same period. We have no way of knowing the daily experiences of an ordinary Persian garrison soldier or a low-ranking official dispatched to Bactria. How were practical issues such as language barriers, cultural differences, and climate adaptation addressed? Did Persian administrators learn local languages, or did they rely on interpreters? How did they handle conflicts with local legal traditions? These seemingly trivial details, in fact, formed the very foundation of imperial rule. This nearly blank decade is crucial for understanding Cyrus and the empire he founded precisely because of its blankness. It reminds us that the rise of the Persian Empire was not a seamless epic of victory after victory, a shape later narrators imposed upon it. In the actual historical process, there exist vast corners we cannot illuminate, unrecorded battles, unwritten negotiations, resistors and collaborators whose names have been lost. When Cyrus finally turned his gaze toward Babylon, was the eastern territory behind him an effectively integrated rear, or a fragile patchwork held together by deterrence and promises? The answer to this question would gradually and brutally reveal itself after his death, as Cambyses and Darius faced rebellions in the empire's east. And around 540 BCE, the ancient city of Babylon in Mesopotamia awaited its new master. In a sense, Cyrus's eastern campaigns foreshadowed a fundamental challenge the Achaemenid Empire would long face: how to maintain effective rule over a space too vast geographically and too diverse culturally. This challenge was particularly acute in the empire's eastern frontiers, which remained a hotbed of rebellion and separatism until the empire's fall. In the late autumn of 539 BC, the palm groves along both banks of the Euphrates rustled in the dry wind at the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. The glazed brick reliefs of bulls and dragons shimmered with blue and gold under the sunlight. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, witnessing Hammurabi's code, the Assyrian sack, and the reconstruction and expansion under Nebuchadnezzar II. At this moment, it remained one of the largest cities in the Near East, its walls, according to ancient records, so thick that chariots could ride side by side atop them. Yet, in this very year, this seemingly impregnable capital would change hands with little large-scale bloodshed. The Persians were about to enter Babylon, and the city's internal fractures, perhaps more than the armies outside its walls, had already sealed its fate. To understand why Babylon opened its gates to Cyrus in 539 BCE, one must first examine the governance challenges faced by its last native king Nabonidus, not a direct heir to the throne. Nabonidus ascended to power in 556 BCE through a palace coup. His mother, Adad-Gupi, according to inscriptions, had deep ties to the worship of the moon god Sin in Haran. Upon taking the throne, Nabonidus implemented a series of religious policies that deeply unsettled the Babylonian priesthood. He vigorously elevated the status of the moon god Sin while showing marked indifference to the traditional rituals of Marduk, the city's chief deity. Even more perplexing, he left Babylon in the middle of his reign and resided for about a decade in the oasis of Tema in northern Arabia, entrusting the capital's daily administration to his crown prince Belshazzar. This prolonged absence still lacks a consensus explanation among scholars, with hypotheses ranging from commercial interests, religious motives, to political asylum, none supported by definitive evidence. The rift created by Nabonidus's religious policies within the Babylonian priestly class can be glimpsed from a cuneiform document known as the Verse Account of Nabonidus. This text vehemently accuses Nabonidus of blaspheming Marduk, neglecting the New Year festival, and deviating from orthodoxy through mad actions. However, it must be immediately noted that this document was likely written after the Persian conquest, and its stance clearly serves the legitimacy narrative of the new regime. In other words, it is impossible to determine to what extent the dissatisfaction of the Babylonian priestly class with Nabonidus was a genuine sentiment beforehand, and to what extent it was a narrative amplified or even constructed after the fact. This presents a fundamental dilemma in the study of historical sources for the late Neo-Babylonian Empire. Almost all surviving Babylonian native texts have been filtered through the perspective of the victors. What we hear are the voices the winners allowed us to hear. The military progression is relatively clear. In the autumn of 539 BC, Cyrus's army defeated the Babylonian defenders at Opis on the banks of the Tigris River. The scale and intensity of this battle are depicted differently across various sources. The Phae-Nabonidus Chronicle, Phae, relatively restrained Babylonian chronicle, records the Battle of Opis and mentions that Cyrus's army carried out some degree of plundering or slaughter in the area, using the phrase, "The property of the people of Akkad was plundered." This detail is noteworthy because it creates a tension with a later portrayal of Cyrus as a peaceful liberator in the Cyrus Cylinder. After the Battle of Opis, the important city of Sippar surrendered without a fight. Subsequently, according to the same chronicle, Cyrus's general Gubaru led his troops into the city of Babylon without a battle. Nabonidus was captured either before or shortly after this event, and his ultimate fate varies across different historical accounts. No battle Phae. These three words form the most central and carefully handled narrative surrounding the transfer of Babylon. This account from the Phae-Nabonidus Chronicle, Phae, is further amplified by the Cyrus Cylinder into an almost idyllic picture. The god Marduk personally selects Cyrus as the righteous ruler, leads him into Babylon, and the entire city rejoices in welcome. But we must ask, is this an accurate record of historical fact, or a politically crafted narrative by the conqueror? Could a massive city with tens of thousands of residents and a complete defensive system truly change hands without any resistance? Perhaps it could, if the power elites within the city had already reached some tacit understanding with the invaders, or perhaps not entirely. The bloodshed at Opis has already proven that this conquest was not entirely peaceful. The truth likely lies somewhere between the two extremes. Babylon itself, indeed, did not experience a large-scale siege. But this does not mean the entire conquest was a transfer of power without violence. Cyrus himself entered Babylon later than the advance forces led by Gubaru. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, he arrived in person approximately 17 days after Gubaru's entry into the city. Upon entering, he proclaimed peace to the entire city and ordered his troops not to harass the residents. This time, gap is itself intriguing. It may suggest that Cyrus waited until the situation within the city was fully stabilized before risking his own presence. Or it could reflect a calculated political performance, allowing the Babylonians to experience a transitional period under the order maintained by Persian generals, before welcoming the true king, who would personally bestow his grace. regardless of the interpretation. This arrangement demonstrates a high degree of political awareness. Cyrus was not merely a conqueror who relied on brute force to invade. He cared deeply about the manner in which he presented himself before this ancient capital. Now we must confront the most important physical evidence of this chapter, the Cyrus cylinder. This is a barrel-shaped clay cylinder, approximately 23 centimeters in length, inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform text. It was excavated in 1879 by Hormuzd Rassam at the site of the Marduk temple in Babylon, and is now housed in the British Museum. The text of the cylinder begins from the perspective of the god Marduk, condemning the various crimes of Nabonidus, abandoning rituals, oppressing the people, and desecrating the gods, before narrating how Marduk sought out a righteous ruler among the nations, namely Cyrus, king of Anshan, commanding him to march on Babylon to restore order. The text then shifts to the first-person voice of Cyrus, declaring his peaceful entry into Babylon, the restoration of the displaced idols of various lands to their original temples, as moved by Nabonidus, the repair of sanctuaries, and the liberation of forcibly relocated populations. The text of the Cyrus cylinder follows a literary paradigm with a long tradition in Mesopotamia, the declaration of justice issued upon the ascension of a new king. In this paradigm, the previous ruler is depicted as tyrannical, immoral, and forsaken by the gods, while the new king is portrayed as the divinely chosen restorer of order. Similar rhetorical templates were used by several Assyrian and Babylonian kings. This indicates that the content of the Cyrus cylinder was not an original Persian invention, but rather a conscious borrowing by the Persian conquerors of the native Babylonian political discourse to legitimize their rule. This point is crucial. It reveals that Cyrus, or more precisely, his advisors and scribes, who were well versed in Babylonian cultural traditions, deeply understood the value of the ruling strategy of speaking in the language of the conquered. The cylinder was not intended for the Persians. It was written for the Babylonians. However, precisely because the Cyrus cylinder fits so perfectly within the Mesopotamian tradition of political propaganda, we must exercise great caution when using it as historical evidence. The claims in the cylinder, such as the peaceful entry into the city, the welcoming by the people, and the restoration of divine statues, raise questions. Which parts are records of actual events? Which are embellishments of real occurrences? And which are purely rhetorical constructs? There are no simple answers to these questions. Taking the return of divine statues as an example, some Babylonian administrative documents do record the administrative operations of returning certain statues to their original temples during the early years of Cyrus's rule, providing a degree of corroboration for the cylinder's narrative. However, descriptions like, "All the people kissed my feet and rejoiced," in the cylinder are almost certainly standardized royal rhetoric, and should not be taken as accurate reports of public sentiment. In the latter half of the 20th century, the Cyrus cylinder underwent a profound modern reinvention. In 1971, during the celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire, the Pahlavi dynasty of Iran brought the Cyrus cylinder to the international stage, promoting it as the world's first declaration of human rights. This characterization was subsequently widely disseminated and even appeared in displays at United Nations events. However, from a strict historical perspective, this label suffers from a fundamental anachronism. Human rights is a modern concept born out of the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Projecting it onto a Mesopotamian royal inscription from the 6th century BCE, regardless of how well-intentioned the motives, constitutes a distortion of historical context. The Cyrus cylinder does not express an awareness of individual rights, but rather serves as a justification for imperial rule. Its logic is that of a divinely chosen king restoring just order, not every person being born with inalienable rights. To state that the Cyrus cylinder is not a declaration of human rights, does not mean denying its historical significance. On the contrary, when we strip away modern projections, the true value of this document becomes clearer. It is one of the earliest surviving complete texts in which a conqueror justifies his rule using the language and religious framework of the conquered civilization. It demonstrates an approach to imperial governance rather than erasing the cultural identity of the conquered. It embeds itself within their cultural narrative. This strategy was repeatedly employed in later Achaemenid rule. Darius presented himself as a pharaoh in Egypt. Xerxes adopted the title King of Babylon and its origin, at least as far as surviving records can trace, can be pinpointed to the moment Cyrus entered Babylon. Before concluding this chapter, it is necessary to shift our focus away from inscriptions and chronicles to consider a more fundamental question. What did the handover of Babylon in 539 BCE mean for the ordinary people living in the city? Cuneiform administrative records reveal a high degree of continuity in commercial contracts, land leases, and debt documentation before and after the change of regime. Archives from prominent Babylonian merchant families, such as the Egebi family, indicate that they continued their operations under Persian rule and may even have benefited from the new imperial trade networks. The temple economic system also appears to have functioned in the short term. These dry administrative documents perhaps tell us more honestly than any grand narrative that, for the artisans, merchants, priests, and farmers of Babylon, the changing royal banners on the city walls were far less immediate than the next season's harvest or the next ledger entry. While the shift of empires was an earth-shattering event at the palace level, at the street level, it might have meant little more than a change in the entity to which taxes were owed. However, this continuity itself should not be overly romanticized. The continuity of administrative archives does not equate to everyone's lives remaining unaffected. To whom did the property of the Akkadian people looted during the Battle of Opis belong? Do the families who lost loved ones in the war appear in any surviving documents? The answer is almost certainly no. Cuneiform archives record the economic activities of property owners, not the suffering of the propertyless. The historical materials we possess inherently favor an elite perspective, a limitation that must be explicitly acknowledged when studying any ancient regime change. The story of Cyrus entering Babylon, whether the divine narrative in the cylinder inscription, the restrained account in the chronicles, or the daily continuity in the administrative archives, represents only a small fragment of the entire reality experienced by this great city that autumn. The transfer of Babylon in 539 BCE occupies a unique place in the history of Cyrus' imperial expansion. It was not merely another military conquest, though it certainly involved military elements, but rather an experiment in political discourse. What Cyrus or his advisors accomplished in Babylon was to frame the conquest as a restoration of divine will and to transform foreign rule into a continuation of the local order. Whether this discourse was sincere is a question beyond the reach of historical inquiry, but its effectiveness is made clear by subsequent events. For the next 2 centuries, Babylon remained one of the most important administrative and economic centers of the Achaemenid Empire, and Persian kings continued to use the title King of Babylon with only occasional interruptions until the empire's decline. The strategy pioneered in the Cyrus cylinder, ruling the conquered in the name of their own gods, will be examined in the next chapter within the broader framework of imperial governance. There, we will ask, was Cyrus's so-called tolerance a personal virtue or a product of the structural needs of empire? In the autumn of 539 BC, after the gates of Babylon were opened to the Persian army, the new conqueror faced not an empty ruin, but the steel-beating heart of an empire. Priests in the temples continued their daily sacrificial rituals. Administrative officials along the canals recorded grain taxes, and merchants in the streets settled debts with silver and barley. When Cyrus entered the city, what he took over was not merely its walls and palaces, but an entire administrative and religious order that had been functioning for centuries. He did not dismantle it. This choice, or rather the sum of these choices, was later encapsulated in a term that sounds warm and concise: policy of tolerance. Yet the term itself is a historical construct that demands unpacking. It implies a moral initiative, as if Cyrus chose to treat the conquered kindly out of some trance, epochal, ethical consciousness. However, when we shift our gaze from Greek narratives and biblical texts to Near Eastern administrative archives and inscriptions, a far more complex and stark picture emerges, one that exceeds what the word tolerance can convey. This complexity first manifests in a fundamental cognitive misalignment. Modern historical understanding of Cyrus's governance is largely built upon retrospective accounts from later sources, which often carry the value judgments and political needs of their own times. The real historical question is not whether Cyrus was tolerant, but why he chose such a mode of governance and how it actually operated under the political and economic conditions of his era. To understand Cyrus's approach to governance, one must first acknowledge a fundamental fact. He was not the first Near Eastern ruler to preserve local religious and administrative structures after conquest. This practice had deep precedents. At the height of its expansion, the Assyrian Empire, though notorious for military violence and forced relocations, also maintained the operation of local temples in many conquered regions, even offering sacrifices to the chief gods of subjugated cities in the name of the Assyrian king. Nebuchadnezzar II of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, while destroying the temple in Jerusalem, extensively renovated the Marduk temple in Babylon itself, sustaining a cooperative relationship with the priestly class. In other words, conquerors respecting the religious order of conquered territories was not an exception in Near Eastern political tradition, but a recurring strategy of rule. The reason Cyrus's approach appears particularly prominent in later times is partly due to his counterpart, Nabonidus, who happened to be a ruler sharply at odds with the Babylonian priestly class over religious policies. Nabonidus's preference for the moon god Sin and his relative neglect of the Marduk temple provided Cyrus with a perfect political opportunity. The harsh criticism of Nabonidus in the Cyrus Cylinder essentially elevates the new ruler by disparaging his predecessor. This is an ancient rhetorical technique, not a moral declaration. So, what did Cyrus's governance look like in practice? Although the existing evidence is fragmented, it is sufficient to outline several key characteristics. In Babylon, Cyrus retained a large number of local officials in their positions. Babylonian administrative tablets show that for several years after the conquest, many of the original governors and local administrators continued to perform their duties, merely changing the allegiance in the document headers from Nabonidus to Cyrus. This was not an administrative revolution, but a replacement of power labels. The temple economy also remained uninterrupted. The Temple of Marduk and other major shrines continued to hold land, labor, and tax privileges, and the social status of the priestly class was maintained. The Cyrus Cylinder explicitly mentions the return of statues relocated by Nabonidus to their original cities, a move that was both a religious gesture and a political signal, indicating to the priestly elites of various cities that the new regime was willing to restore the traditional order disrupted by its predecessor. However, it must be noted that this information almost entirely comes from Babylonian local documents and the propaganda texts of Cyrus's regime, lacking independent critical records from the conquered side. More importantly, maintaining this administrative continuity came at a cost. Cyrus had to acknowledge and respect the existing distribution of interests, which meant he could not radically reconfigure Babylon's financial resources. Beyond Babylon, the evidence becomes sparser, but the general direction remains consistent. In Lydia, according to Herodotus, after conquering Sardis, Cyrus did not carry out large-scale reprisals against the Lydians. Instead, while appointing a Persian satrap, he preserved parts of the local administrative structure. The Greek city-states in Asia Minor, after being incorporated into Persian control, largely retained internal autonomy, only required to pay tribute and comply with military conscription. This model later came to be seen as the prototype of the satrapy system. But in Cyrus's time, it was far from the systematic provincial structure later established by Darius I. The satraps of Cyrus's era were more like military agents dispatched to various regions with ambiguous boundaries of authority. The distribution of power between them and local elites often depended on specific negotiations rather than a unified institutional framework. This is crucial. Cyrus's governance model was more a series of ad hoc arrangements adapted to local conditions than a top-down imperial institutional design. This flexibility was both an advantage and a potential risk. It allowed for rapid adaptation to local circumstances, but also sowed the seeds of institutional risks, such as unclear power boundaries and ambiguous accountability. It is precisely here that we need to pause the narrative and examine a methodological issue. Our understanding of Cyrus's governance relies heavily on three types of historical sources. First, the propaganda texts of Cyrus's regime, represented by the Cyrus Cylinder. Second, the accounts of Greek historians, exemplified by Herodotus and Xenophon. And third, daily administrative records, such as Babylonian clay tablets. Each of these sources has its own blind spots. The Cyrus Cylinder is a self-representation of the victor, with every sentence serving the construction of legitimacy. Greek sources carry the distance and cultural biases of external observers. As Herodotus's knowledge of Persian administrative details is clearly inferior to his interest in war stories. Although Babylonian administrative tablets are relatively objective, they record daily affairs rather than policy intentions. We can see what happened from them, but find it difficult to infer why it was done. This means that any assertion about Cyrus's governance motivations, whether attributed to moral consciousness or practical calculation, inevitably contains a significant amount of speculation. More complexly, these three types of sources also differ significantly in their timespans. The Cyrus Cylinder records policy declarations from the early conquest period. Greek sources often reflect retrospective narratives from decades later, and administrative tablets provide scattered time slices, lacking a continuous policy trajectory. After acknowledging the limitations of historical records, we can still make limited inferences about the internal logic of Cyrus's governance model. A core question is, why was preserving local structures more in the interest of the conqueror than destroying them? The answer may not be complicated. Within less than 2 decades, Cyrus conquered vast territories from Anatolia to Central Asia. Although his army was powerful, the Persian population was extremely limited compared to the total population of the conquered regions. Given this demographic ratio, attempting to replace the existing administrative systems across various regions entirely with Persian officials was not only impractical in terms of manpower, but also bound to provoke large-scale resistance. Preserving the power and status of local elites in exchange for their loyalty and cooperation with the new regime was the most cost-effective method of control. This requires no moral explanation. It was a natural choice when the speed of imperial expansion outpaced administrative capacity. Of course, calling it a pragmatic strategy does not mean that Cyrus himself had no personal inclination toward religious tolerance. We simply lack sufficient evidence to confirm or deny this. From another perspective, This governance model also reflects the Persians' own political tradition. As a relatively young political entity, Persia lacked the mature imperial administrative traditions of Assyria or Babylon, making it more receptive to diversified governance arrangements. Another noteworthy dimension of this governance model is its actual impact on the ordinary people in the conquered regions. Later generations' praise of Cyrus's policy of tolerance often focuses on his cooperative relationships with local elites, priests, nobles, and regional governors. But what did the change of conquerors mean for the farmers by the Babylonian canals, the small vendors in the Lydian markets, or the ordinary members of the Jewish community who were forcibly relocated and later allowed to return home? Babylonian economic tablets reveal that the debt relationships, land lease contracts, and labor obligations of ordinary workers did not change significantly before and after the regime transition. Taxes continued to be collected, labor services were still enforced, and the social hierarchy remained largely untouched. For the nameless participants at the bottom of the empire, tolerance might have meant the absence of additional violence, but it did not signify an improvement in living conditions. The empire's benevolence has always had its limits, and these limits were defined by the efficiency of governance, not humanitarianism. In fact, in some cases, Persian rule may have even increased the burden on ordinary people. The empire needed to maintain a vast military and administrative apparatus, the costs of which were ultimately passed on to the grassroots producers through taxation. Contrasting Cyrus's governance model with that of his successor, Darius I, more clearly reveals the institutional characteristics, or more accurately, the lack thereof, of Cyrus's era. After seizing the throne in 522 BCE, Darius I undertook extensive systematic reforms of the imperial administrative system. He divided the empire into approximately 20 provinces, each overseen by 3 parallel institutions: a governor, a military commander, and a tax collector to ensure checks and balances. He standardized weights, measures, and the monetary system, and constructed the royal road from Sardis to Susa to expedite information transmission. In the Behistun inscription, he proclaimed the legitimacy of his rule in 3 languages, establishing a standardized imperial ideological discourse. Almost none of these institutions existed during Cyrus's time. Cyrus left behind no known provincial division plan, no unified taxation standards, and no systematic bureaucratic hierarchy. His empire resembled more a network woven from personal loyalty, military deterrence, and temporary agreements than an institutionalized administrative machine. This is not a criticism of Cyrus, it merely illustrates that the institutionalization of an empire requires time. And Cyrus spent most of his reign on conquest, leaving very limited room for administrative development. In this sense, Cyrus was more of a great military entrepreneur than an institution builder. The debate within the historical community regarding Cyrus's governance model has undergone a significant pendulum swing over the past half-century. In the mid-20th century, influenced by both Iranian nationalist narratives and the Cold War-era discourse of dialogue among civilizations, Cyrus was widely portrayed as a pioneer of human rights and the father of religious tolerance. The Cyrus Cylinder was even referred to by some scholars and political figures as the first declaration of human rights. This characterization reached its peak during the 2,500-year celebration of the Pahlavi dynasty in 1971. However, starting in the 1980s, a group of revisionist historians began systematically questioning this narrative. They pointed out that the textual form of the Cyrus Cylinder strictly adheres to the traditional conventions of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, where expressions of mercy toward the conquered were standardized rhetorical tropes, rather than unique reflections of Cyrus's personal philosophy. Interpreting an ancient Near Eastern political propaganda text through the modern concept of human rights constitutes a serious anachronism. This critique is compelling, but has the pendulum swung too far? Some scholars caution that, even if Cyrus's actions had precedence and his motivations included pragmatic calculations, this does not entirely negate the uniqueness of his governance model, in terms of scale and consistency. After all, no previous empire had simultaneously maintained such diverse religious and administrative traditions across such a vast territory. This scale alone constitutes a qualitative difference. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is to acknowledge that we cannot make a clear-cut judgment between moral consciousness and practical strategy. These two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible for a ruler to adopt the same policy out of both pragmatic considerations and personal beliefs. And the historical records available to us are insufficient to separate and weigh these two motivations individually. What we can confirm is the outcome. The empire established by Cyrus, during its more than 2 centuries of existence, indeed accommodated multiple languages, religions, and legal traditions from Egypt to Central Asia. This fact in itself constitutes a significant political experiment in the ancient world. However, attributing all the credit for this experiment solely to Cyrus's foresight is an oversimplification. The empire's diversity was both a product of policy choices and a passive result of conquest outpacing assimilation. After Cyrus, this loosely structured governance network would face severe tests. His son Cambyses and successor Darius. I would have to answer a question that Cyrus himself never directly addressed when the empire ceased to expand. Could a diverse order sustained only by military deterrence and temporary agreements continue to function? The answer to this question would determine whether the Persian Empire could transform from a conqueror's personal achievement into a truly institutionalized state. From this perspective, Cyrus's governance model was both the starting point of the Persian Empire and the historical foundation it had to transcend. At a certain moment in 538 BCE, an administrative decree issued in the name of the Achaemenid royal family traveled westward through the Mesopotamian postal road system. The exact wording of the decree has been lost to history, but its consequences are repeatedly mentioned in multiple documents. A group of Jews dispersed in Babylon were permitted to return to Jerusalem and allowed to rebuild their destroyed temple. The issuer of this decree was Cyrus. Prior to this, he had just entered the city of Babylon as the chosen king of the god Marduk, and his cylinder inscription praised the chief deity of Babylon in Akkadian. Afterward, he would be referred to in the book of Isaiah as the Anointed One of Yahweh, a title never bestowed upon any other non-Jew. A Persian monarch simultaneously appropriated by 2 mutually exclusive monotheistic traditions as an executor of divine will. This fact itself serves as the best entry point for understanding Cyrus's politics of faith. The Book of Ezra, chapter 1, provides the most complete text of this decree. The scripture records Cyrus declaring, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah." The wording of this passage is striking. A Persian king not only acknowledges the authority of Yahweh, but also claims to have been directly commissioned by this God of the Jews. Taken literally, Cyrus appears to be a sincere convert with genuine faith in Yahweh. However, the vast majority of modern historians approach this with caution. The Book of Ezra was compiled at least a century after Cyrus's lifetime, and its editors were primarily concerned with providing theological legitimacy for the Jewish community's return and the rebuilding of the temple, rather than faithfully recording the exact wording of Persian administrative documents. In other words, the voice of Cyrus in the scripture likely underwent theological reinterpretation by Jewish editors. However, it is equally unfounded to completely deny the historical core of this decree. Chapter 6 of the Book of Ezra preserves another version, purportedly written in Aramaic, which reads more like an imperial administrative memorandum than the theological proclamation of Chapter 1, focusing on the dimensions of the temple, the sources of funding for its construction, and the details of returning the sacred vessels. Many scholars believe that this Aramaic version is more likely to retain traces of the original administrative order, while the Hebrew version in Chapter 1 is a propagandistic adaptation aimed at the Jewish community. The tension between the two versions reflects a broader issue. Cyrus's religious stance presented different faces to different audiences, and each document we possess captures only one aspect of it. Shifting our gaze from Jewish texts to Babylonian documents, Cyrus's religious image undergoes a complete transformation. The Cyrus cylinder, an Akkadian text we discussed in Chapter 5, attributes Cyrus's victory entirely to the divine will of Marduk. The inscription claims that Marduk, dissatisfied with Nabonidus's neglect of the Babylonian gods, searched for a righteous ruler among all lands, and ultimately chose Cyrus. In this narrative, Cyrus is not the anointed of Yahweh, but the agent of Marduk. His entry into Babylon is not a conquest, but a restoration of divine order. The wording of the inscription strictly adheres to the millennia old Mesopotamian tradition of royal legitimacy, where a new king overthrows the old, because the latter has lost divine favor. This rhetorical template appears repeatedly in Assyrian and Babylonian history. The Cyrus cylinder is not an innovation, but a precise application of an established political, theological grammar. Here we must pause the narrative to examine the nature of the historical sources we are using. Neither the Book of Ezra nor the Cyrus cylinder serves as direct evidence of Cyrus's personal religious beliefs. The cylinder inscription is a political text drafted with the involvement of the Babylonian priestly class, aimed at legitimizing the new regime to the local Babylonian elite. The Book of Ezra is a compilation by the Jewish diaspora community, which, after their return, sought to imbue their historical experience with theological meaning. Both documents are using Cyrus, embedding him within their respective theological frameworks. What we can confirm is this: Cyrus's regime did permit the return of the Jews and the rebuilding of the temple, and it indeed adopted an official discourse venerating Marduk in Babylon. However, deducing Cyrus's personal faith from these policy actions is a methodologically perilous leap. Policy does not equate to faith, just as diplomatic rhetoric does not equate to inner monologue. However, in the reception history of Jewish tradition, the image of Cyrus extends far beyond that of a friendly foreign monarch. Isaiah 45 directly refers to him as the Messiah, the Anointed One in Hebrew, a term that would later be reserved for the Savior in Christian tradition. This is the only instance in the entire Hebrew Bible where this title is bestowed upon a non-Jew. The theological weight of this designation is immense. It signifies that, in the prophetic vision, Yahweh's plan of redemption could be realized through a foreign ruler who did not know Yahweh. I call you by your name, though you do not know me, as the scripture states. The dating of this passage is debated, with some scholars attributing it to a prophet of the 6th century BCE diaspora, while others view it as a later editorial addition. Regardless of its composition date, the theological logic it reflects is clear. Cyrus was incorporated into the historical narrative of Jewish monotheism, serving as evidence of divine while operating in the world of the Gentiles. If Jewish and Babylonian texts each drape Cyrus in distinct theological garments, the third dimension of inquiry proves even more challenging. What exactly was Cyrus's own Persian religious background? This question directly touches upon the status of Zoroastrianism in the early Achaemenid period, which remains one of the most fiercely debated topics in Iranian studies. Centered on the teachings of the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroastrianism emphasizes Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity, and posits a cosmic dualism of good and evil as the fundamental structure of the universe. This belief system later became the established state religion during the Sasanian Empire. But whether it held such a position in Cyrus's time remains an unresolved scholarly debate. The difficulty first arises from the lack of evidence. None of the inscriptions left by Cyrus himself, primarily the Cyrus cylinder and a few architectural inscriptions from Pasargadae, mention the name of Ahura Mazda. This stands in stark contrast to his successor Darius I, who repeatedly declared in the Behistun inscription that his kingship was granted by Ahura Mazda, with Zoroastrian theological vocabulary occupying a central place in Darius's official discourse. The absence of this name in Cyrus's inscriptions could imply several possibilities. Perhaps Persian religion during Cyrus's time had not yet evolved into mature Zoroastrianism, and the worship of Ahura Mazda was merely one among many Iranian religious traditions. Alternatively, Cyrus himself may have adhered to some form of Mazda worship, but deliberately chose local theological vocabulary in inscriptions intended for a Babylonian audience. Or perhaps both factors were at play. We cannot be certain. Some scholars have attempted to find clues from the architectural remains of Pasargadae. The city of Cyrus, Pasargadae, indeed contains stone structures referred to by archaeologists as fire altars, which held a central role in later Zoroastrian rituals. However, the issue is that the worship of fire was not exclusive to Zoroastrianism in the ancient Iranian world. It may have belonged to an older and broader Iranian religious tradition. Directly equating the fire altars of Pasargadae with Zoroastrian worship facilities is an archaeological inference that requires careful consideration. Similarly, a winged human figure relief on a lintel in Pasargadae has been interpreted by some scholars as a Zoroastrian representation of Cyrus himself. But this interpretation is also highly controversial. Other scholars argue that it draws from Assyrian or Elamite iconographic traditions and has no direct connection to Zoroastrianism. When expanding the perspective from a single site to the broader history of Iranian religion, the issue becomes more complex. A significant consensus in contemporary Iranian scholarship is that the religious landscape of 6th century BC Iran was far more diverse and fluid than what later Orthodox Zoroastrian narratives suggest. While Zarathustra's teachings may have spread among some Iranian groups, it remains uncertain whether they had formed a unified doctrinal system, established an institutionalized priestly class, or been formally adopted as the official faith by the Achaemenid royal family. It is reasonable to speculate that Persian religious practices during Cyrus's era might have been a hybrid state. The worship of Ahura Mazda coexisted with reverence for other Iranian deities such as Mithra and Anahita, and Zarathustra's ethical teachings intertwined with older ritual traditions, not yet crystallizing into the clearly defined orthodox doctrines of later periods. It is within this context of religious diversity that Cyrus's tolerant stance toward the religions of conquered peoples gains a richer interpretive dimension. One possibility is that Cyrus did not approach other religions from an already established monotheistic position, but operated within a religious environment inherently characterized by polytheism or pantheism. For an Iranian monarch living in an era when religious boundaries were not yet solidified, venerating Babylon's Marduk and permitting the Jews to rebuild the temple of Yahweh might not have constituted the kind of cross-religious tolerance we understand today. It may have simply been a matter of political pragmatism taken for granted in a polytheistic world. Of course, this interpretation itself remains speculative. We lack sufficient evidence to determine where Cyrus's personal religious stance fell on the spectrum between a devotee of Mazda worship and a pure political pragmatist. A noteworthy comparative case is the parallel between Cyrus's policy toward the Jewish community and his policy toward the local temples in Babylon. The Cyrus cylinder inscription records that Cyrus ordered the return of the statues of gods, which Nabonidus had relocated from various regions to Babylon to their original places. A policy that benefited not only the Jews, but the diverse religious communities across Mesopotamia. From this perspective, allowing the Jews to return and rebuild their temple was not a special favor granted exclusively to them, but rather part of a broader imperial religious policy. The logic behind this policy was to restore the religious order disrupted by Nabonidus, thereby consolidating the legitimacy of the new regime among local communities. Jewish tradition interprets this policy as Yahweh's special favor toward the chosen people, while Babylonian texts interpret it as Marduk's reward for a righteous king. Both interpretations are true, yet both are partial. In this intricate tapestry of faith and politics, there is another often overlooked group, the ordinary Persians who left no written records. The empire's inscriptions reflect the religious discourse of the court, and Jewish scriptures capture the theological reflections of the diaspora elite. But what were the reactions of common Persian soldiers, artisans, and administrators? After Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, when confronted with the city's dazzling temple architecture and unfamiliar religious rituals, did they feel their beliefs were offended? Or did they pragmatically accept the empire's religious pluralism? These questions remain unanswered, but raising them serves as a necessary corrective to the monopoly of elite narratives. History is not only written by kings and priests, but also shaped by its silent participants. Gathering the threads from this chapter, we are confronted with a historical figure who cannot be confined to any single religious label in Jewish tradition. Cyrus is the anointed of Yahweh. In Babylonian tradition, he is the chosen one of Marduk, and in later Iranian tradition, he is a devout follower of Zoroastrianism. Yet, under rigorous historical scrutiny, none of these three identities can be fully confirmed, nor can any be entirely dismissed. Perhaps this very uncertainty is the closest we can come to historical truth. A monarch ruling over a vast empire stretching from the Iranian plateau to the Mesopotamian plains would almost inevitably have religious practices that were multifaceted, strategic, and context-dependent. Attempting to extract a true faith of Cyrus may have been a misguided question from the outset. This very ambiguity of belief provides a thought-provoking backdrop for the final military adventure of Cyrus, which we will explore in the next chapter. His fatal conflict with the Massagetae on the northeastern frontier of his empire. A ruler crowned by multiple theological traditions ultimately fell on the grasslands, beyond the reach of divine protection. Around 530 BC, on the grasslands north of the Darya River, a Persian army was crossing the water. The river had not yet fully thawed, and chunks of ice drifted slowly across its murky surface. As the cavalry's horses stepped into the shallows, they sent up sprays of icy water. Leading this army was Cyrus himself, now in his 60s, with a vast empire stretching from the eastern shores of the Aegean Sea to the heart of Central Asia behind him. He had captured Sardis, entered Babylon, and compelled countless city-states and kingdoms to open their gates before him. But this time, he faced no walls, no palaces, none of the defensive systems of the settled civilizations he knew so well. Across the river lay an endless expanse of grassland, and his opponents on those plains built no cities, stored no granaries, and waited to be conquered in no fixed location. This was an entirely different kind of war. Why did Cyrus personally lead his army northward when the empire's territory was already so vast? The answer to this question is not as clear as later narratives suggest. Herodotus attributed the motivation for this expedition to Cyrus's anger after his marriage proposal to Thamyris, the queen of the Massagetae, was rejected. A narrative imbued with strong Greek tragic overtones. depicting a proud conqueror brought to ruin by desire and arrogance. However, if we temporarily set aside this dramatic framework and examine the matter from the perspective of imperial security, Cyrus's northern campaign may have had more pragmatic reasons. The Darya River basin was the most vulnerable frontier in the northeast of the empire, where seasonal incursions by nomadic tribes posed a continuous threat to newly conquered provinces such as Bactria and Sogdiana. For an empire that had just completed a large-scale expansion, its frontiers were never static lines, but dynamic zones that required constant military pressure to maintain. Cyrus may have reasoned that it was better to push the front line across the river rather than wait for the nomads to move south. Of course, this is merely speculation based on imperial logic, and we cannot know his true considerations with certainty. Who were the Massagetae? This question itself reveals the limitations of our historical sources. Herodotus described them as a nomadic people living north of the Darya and east of the Araxes River, surviving on horseback archery and mare's milk, worshipping the sun god, and crafting weapons from bronze and gold. He also mentioned that they practiced a form of elder sacrifice, but such descriptions were almost standardized templates in Greek ethnography for all barbarians, making it difficult to reconstruct the true nature of Massagetae society based on these accounts. Modern scholars have diverse opinions on the ethnic classification of the Massagetae. Some link them to the Scythians. Others believe they were the ancestors of the later Yuezhi. And some argue that the name itself may have encompassed multiple loosely allied nomadic groups rather than a unified ethnic entity. The only relatively certain facts are that they controlled the vast steppe region north of the Darya, possessed a considerable cavalry force, and were not part of any tribute or subjugation system previously established by the Persian Empire. According to Herodotus, Cyrus first proposed a marriage alliance to Tomyris, the queen of the Massagetae, before launching his campaign. Tomyris refused and warned Cyrus not to cross the river. This narrative serves a clear structural function in Herodotus's text. It establishes a moral premise for Cyrus's eventual downfall. He was given the chance to retreat, but chose to advance. This is a typical Greek narrative pattern of hubris, forming a cross-volume parallel with the episode where Croesus is warned by an oracle before attacking Persia. It is reasonable to believe that the marriage proposal itself may indeed have occurred. Political marriages between nomadic regimes, as well as between nomadic and settled powers, were not uncommon in ancient Central Asia. However, Herodotus's narration of this event is clearly deeply shaped by the logic of Greek tragedy. Tomyris's calm and dignified refusal in the text is less a historical record and more a carefully crafted literary introduction arranged by Herodotus for the queen. It is necessary here to pause the narrative and examine the historical sources we are relying on. Regarding the battle between Cyrus and the Massagetae, Herodotus is the only ancient author who provides a complete account of the campaign. Ctesias offers a completely different version of Cyrus's death, that he died in battle against the Derbaces, but his records are fragmentary and have long been questioned for their reliability. In the Behistun inscription, Darius mentions the legitimacy of his succession, but remains silent on the manner of Cyrus's death. A damaged record in the Babylonian astronomical diaries may be related to Cyrus's death, but the text is too fragmented to provide definitive information. This means that nearly all our knowledge of this battle, from the marriage proposal to the river crossing decision, from the strategy of luring the enemy to the final battlefield outcome, has been filtered through Herodotus as the sole narrator. He wrote approximately 70 years after the events, and his sources may have included Persian court rumors and accounts from Greek merchants, but there are no first-hand battlefield records. This does not mean his narrative is entirely unreliable, but it requires us to remain vigilant when reading every detail. What we see is Herodotus's account of Cyrus's death, not necessarily the death of Cyrus itself. Returning to Herodotus's narrative, he records that Cyrus adopted the advice of Croesus, the former king of Lydia. A detail that is itself questionable, as there is no independent historical evidence to confirm whether Croesus was still serving as an advisor to Cyrus at this time. According to Herodotus, Croesus suggested that Cyrus crossed the Darya river and set up a feast on the opposite bank as bait, leaving a weak force to guard the camp along with abundant wine and food, while the main army withdrew and concealed itself. The vanguard of the Massagetae indeed attacked the camp, and after indulging in food and drink, fell into a deep slumber, only to be annihilated by the Persian ambush. Tomyris' son, Spargapises, was captured in this ambush, and according to Herodotus, committed suicide out of shame upon regaining consciousness. This narrative of a baiting strategy is not unique in military history. Similar feast traps appear repeatedly in the war legends of multiple ancient civilizations, making it difficult to determine whether it was an actual tactical maneuver or a widely circulated narrative motif. The success of the ambush did not bring an end to the war. On the contrary, it enraged Tomyris. Herodotus writes that Tomyris sent messengers to Cyrus demanding the return of her son and the withdrawal of his army, or else she would make him drink his fill of blood. This statement in Herodotus's text carries a prophetic quality. It precisely foreshadows the famous scene later in which Tomyris immerses Cyrus's head in a wineskin filled with blood. As a historical record, such a meticulously crafted narrative structure is a hallmark of literary embellishment. Yet, setting aside the rhetorical layer, Tomyris's anger itself is entirely justified in political logic. The capture and death of her heir was not only a personal loss, but also a direct blow to the political structure of the Massagetae. She had every reason to rally all her forces and launch a counterattack. Here, the Tomyris depicted by Herodotus emerges not merely as a grieving mother, but as a political leader, capable of swiftly mobilizing her military after the loss of her son. Such political agency is uncommon in Greek historians' portrayals of barbarian women, and perhaps for this very reason, it carries a certain credibility. The exact location of the decisive battle remains unknown. Herodotus only mentions that it took place in the territory of the Massagetae, somewhere on the steppe north of the Darya river. He described the battle as the fiercest ever fought among barbarians, a phrasing that reveals a Helleноcentric bias, as in Herodotus' classification system, the Persians were also considered barbarians. According to his account, the battle began with an exchange of arrows, and after the arrows were exhausted, it turned into close-quarters combat, with both sides locked in a prolonged stalemate. This pattern of ranged combat, followed by melee, appears repeatedly in Herodotus' descriptions of other battles. It may reflect the general dynamics of ancient cavalry warfare, or it might simply be a narrative formula Herodotus used to depict all large-scale battles. We cannot know for certain. What is certain is the outcome of the battle. The Persian army suffered a devastating defeat, and Cyrus himself died on that steppe. Herodotus crafted a highly ritualistic end for Cyrus's death. After finding his body on the battlefield, Tomyris severed his head, immersed it in a wineskin filled with human blood, and declared, "I am alive, and I have defeated you in battle. But you took my son through deceit and destroyed me. Now, as I warned you, I will let you drink your fill of blood." This scene has been repeatedly depicted in Western art history, from Rubens to numerous Renaissance painters. However, as a historical event, its credibility is highly questionable. Locating a specific body on the battlefield and carrying out a ritualistic act of revenge would have been extremely difficult under the chaotic conditions of a large-scale cavalry battle. More importantly, this scene perfectly serves Herodotus's central theme throughout his work, that those who overstep their bounds will face retribution. The immersion of Cyrus's head in the blood-filled wineskin is structurally similar in narrative function to Croesus being placed on the pyre. Both represent moments of ultimate power and the final judgment of fate upon the conqueror. The death of Cyrus had an immediate and profound impact on the Persian Empire. His son, Cambyses II, succeeded to the throne. Yet, the situation in the empire's northeastern frontier remained unstable. The Massagetae were not subdued, and the steppes north of the Darya remained a region where imperial power could not be effectively projected. This reality echoed throughout the subsequent history of the Persian Empire. Darius I later had to commit substantial military resources to Central Asia, and the Behistun inscription records numerous rebellions involving the empire's eastern provinces. Cyrus's failure revealed a structural dilemma faced by all ancient sedentary empires. The logic of imperial expansion was built on capturing cities, controlling agricultural regions, and taking over administrative systems. However, when its borders advanced to the fringes of the nomadic world, this logic lost its foothold. On the steppes, there were no capitals to conquer, no bureaucratic systems to take over, and no supply lines to cut off. The nomads could retreat indefinitely, dragging their pursuers into the abyss of broken supply chains. Cyrus may have been the first Persian king to pay the ultimate price for this lesson, but he was not the last. However, we must approach the widely accepted narrative that Cyrus died at the hands of the Massagetae with caution. As mentioned earlier, Ctesias offers a completely different version. Cyrus died in battle against the Derbaces, sustaining a fatal wound before being carried back to camp, where he arranged his succession on his deathbed. According to Ctesias, this process lasted 3 days, during which Cyrus completed his will while conscious. This account stands in stark contrast to Herodotus's depiction of an immediate death on the battlefield. Ctesias, who served as a royal physician in the Persian court, theoretically had access to internal court archives and oral traditions. But his works are notorious for exaggeration and inaccuracies. The ancient author Plutarch even criticized him for filling his pages with lies. Neither version can be independently verified, and the contradiction between them serves as a reminder. What we possess regarding the true circumstances of Cyrus's final moments is not history, but 2 competing stories. Cyrus fell at the edge of his empire. This fact alone may be more thought-provoking than any legendary account of his death. Over more than 2 decades, he built one of the largest empires of the ancient world, rising from a vassal prince of Anshan to the conqueror of Babylon. Yet, he did not die in a palace or in a coup. But on a grassland, he could not conquer. This conclusion elevates Cyrus's story from a mere imperial biography to a broader historical question. Where are the limits of imperial expansion? Is it the geographical frontier, the breaking point of logistics, or the conqueror's own blind spot regarding the boundaries of power? Herodotus answered this question with Thamyris's blood-filled wineskin, a moral allegory. The answer history can offer may be simpler and more honest. We do not fully know how Cyrus died, but we know he died on the path forward, and the empire behind him had to learn to exist without him. In the next chapter, we will return to Pasargadae, facing the simple stone tomb that still stands on the Iranian plateau, along with the 3 conflicting narratives of death surrounding it. One day around 530 BCE, a procession slowly made its way from the northeastern frontier of the empire toward the southwest. What they escorted was no longer a living conqueror, but the body of Cyrus. No contemporary records document the route of this procession, its attendants, or the reactions of the towns along the way. All we know is the destination, Pasargadae, the ceremonial capital built by Cyrus himself, the symbolic starting point of Persian Achaemenid sovereignty. The body was eventually laid to rest in a stone tomb, a structure that still stands today on the arid plains of Iran's Fars province, serving as the only tangible evidence in the entire narrative of Cyrus's death that can be touched by hand. Yet, the journey from the battlefield to the tomb is shrouded in almost complete silence in historical records. The composition of this escort itself remains a mystery. Was it made up of loyal Persian nobles, or did it include representatives of conquered peoples? Did they travel along the empire's postal road system, or did they choose more secretive routes to avoid causing unrest? Were the satraps along the way notified in advance? And how did the garrisons in various regions react? The answers to these questions have vanished into the mists of time, leaving only the stone tomb as the silent witness to this final journey. Herodotus provides the most widely circulated account of Cyrus's death. According to Herodotus, Cyrus fought against the Massagetae in the Darya region. He initially won through a cunning strategy, luring the Massagetae vanguard with a lavish feast, getting them drunk, and then annihilating them, capturing the son of Queen Thamyris, Spargapises. The prince, sober and ashamed, later took his own life, Thamyris, then led her main forces in a counterattack, resulting in what Herodotus described as the fiercest battle ever fought between barbarians. Most of the Persian army was destroyed, and Cyrus himself fell on the battlefield. Herodotus also recounts a highly dramatic conclusion. Thamyris ordered her soldiers to find Cyrus's body on the battlefield and immerse his head in a wineskin filled with human blood, avenging his bloodlust and greed. This scene has been repeatedly depicted in later literature and art. But whether it is a record of historical events or another literary dramatization of the Greek narrative motif, hubris leads to downfall remains unverifiable. In describing this battle, Herodotus employed numerous rhetorical details. The bravery of the Massagetae, the cunning of the Persians, and the bloodshed on the battlefield, which resemble the products of epic tradition rather than historical records. Based on eyewitness testimony, more notably, Herodotus framed the battle within a larger moral context. Cyrus's death is portrayed as the ultimate punishment for his insatiable desire for expansion. Herodotus's narrative, though vivid, suffers from significant structural issues. In recounting this event, he himself acknowledged that there were multiple accounts of Cyrus's death, and he selected the one he deemed most credible. This candid admission itself reminds us that even in the 5th century BCE, the manner of Cyrus's death was already a topic of much debate. More crucially, Herodotus wrote approximately 70 years after Cyrus's death, and his sources were almost certainly oral traditions rather than written records. The detail of Thamyris dipping the head into a wineskin of blood aligns closely with the Greek literary stereotype of the barbarian queen, a foreign woman portrayed as both fierce and cruel, just yet savage. This does not necessarily mean the detail is fabricated, but its narrative function clearly extends beyond mere factual recording. Herodotus's criteria for selection are themselves questionable. What exactly did he base his judgment of most credible on? Was it because this version was the most widely circulated among his sources, or because it best fit his understanding of historical causality? We cannot know for certain, but this very uncertainty highlights the fundamental limitations of early historical methodology. According to Ctesias, the death of Cyrus occurred in a completely different context. Ctesias, a Greek physician who served in the Persian court from the late 5th to early 4th century BCE, claimed to have had access to the Persian royal archives. In his version, Cyrus did not die at the hands of the Massagetae, but was wounded in battle against the Dervises, and later succumbed to his injuries in his tent. Ctesias also describes Cyrus's final arrangements in his will, including the distribution of power between his successor Cambyses and his younger son Darya. However, Ctesias's credibility was questioned even in antiquity, with Plutarch bluntly stating that he was full of absurd tales and foolish fabrications. Modern scholars also harbor serious doubts about whether he truly accessed Persian archives, as many of his accounts directly contradict known cuneiform records. His version offers a different narrative framework, but the foundation of this framework is equally unstable. The archival sources Ctesias claimed to have used may have existed, but his interpretation and retelling of these documents clearly underwent significant literary embellishment. The final testament of Cyrus in his writings is filled with Hellenized political wisdom, which appears more like Ctesias's own imagination of how an ideal monarch should arrange succession rather than a record of the actual situation in the Persian court. Xenophon offers a third version, and the differences between it and the previous two are so stark that one might almost doubt they are telling the story of the same person. In Phaseropedia, Xenophon depicts Cyrus passing away peacefully in his palace, where, on his deathbed, he summons his sons and courtiers to deliver a lengthy speech on the immortality of the soul, the succession of power, and the governance of virtue through moral excellence. This scene features no battlefield, no bloodshed, and no revenge from a nomadic queen. Only the composure and wisdom of a philosopher, king at the end of his life. The issue, however, is that Xenophon's purpose in writing Phaseropedia was never to record historical facts, but to use Cyrus's name to construct an educational model of an ideal ruler. His portrayal of Cyrus's death is, in essence, a Persian variation of Socrates' death, a wise man calmly discussing the meaning of death surrounded by his disciples. This is literature, not historiography, yet its influence on shaping Cyrus's image for later generations is no less significant than Herodotus's battlefield narrative. The philosophical depth and moral elevation displayed by Xenophon's Cyrus in his final speech align perfectly with the Platonic school's expectations of an ideal ruler. This deliberate idealization makes the entire death scene resemble a carefully orchestrated philosophical dialogue, rather than a record of a historical event. The juxtaposition of these three narratives reveals not only contradictions at the factual level, but also the fundamental dilemma of ancient historical methodology. Herodotus relied on oral traditions, imbuing his narrative with a strong moral allegorical tone. Ctesias claimed to depend on archival records, yet his credibility itself is questionable. Xenophon openly reshaped historical figures through literary techniques, aiming for edification rather than documentation. We have no direct Persian records detailing the circumstances of Cyrus's death. Babylonian astronomical logs provide a rough time frame for his demise, but remain silent on the cause and location of his death. This means that, for a ruler who established the first empire spanning 3 continents in human history, we cannot even ascertain where he died, by whose hand, or in what manner. This gap in knowledge itself may be more worthy of our attention than any specific version of his death. Even more perplexing is that each of these 3 narratives had its own supporters and channels of dissemination in antiquity. They are not simply matters of right or wrong, but reflect different understandings and expectations of the same historical figure across diverse cultural contexts. Each narrative carries specific political intentions and cultural values, and their very existence contributes to the complexity of Cyrus as a historical figure. Regardless of how Cyrus died, his remains ultimately arrived at Pasargadae. The city itself served as a physical embodiment of Cyrus's narrative of power. It was not a traditional city, lacking densely populated areas enclosed by walls, but rather a collection of scattered palaces, gardens, and ceremonial structures spread across an open plain. Archaeological excavations reveal that the architectural style of Pasargadae blended elements from multiple civilizations: Ionic-style stone columns, Lydian stone masonry techniques, Mesopotamian platform foundations, and Elamite tower structures. This eclectic style was not a haphazard assemblage, but likely a deliberate imperial aesthetic statement. A visual declaration by the new regime of its inheritance and integration of diverse cultural traditions. Cyrus's tomb is situated in the southwestern corner of this imperial landscape, maintaining a significant distance from the palace complex. This spatial arrangement may reflect the Persians' unique understanding of death and power dynamics. The deceased ruler needed to remain connected to the world of the living while preserving a sacred separation. The overall layout of Pasargadae suggests a novel concept of imperial space, one that no longer relied on walls and fortresses to assert authority, but instead conveyed political messages through the distribution and style of its architecture. The tomb itself is surprisingly simple in design, constructed from white limestone. It features a six-tiered stepped base that gradually narrows upward, topped by a small burial chamber with a triangular roof, reaching a total height of about 11 meters. The interior of the chamber is extremely limited, accommodating only a stone sarcophagus and a few burial items, compared to the grand royal tombs of the contemporary Near East. Whether the pyramids of Egypt or the massive tumuli of Lydia, the scale of Cyrus's tomb can almost be described as restrained. Scholars have proposed various hypotheses regarding the architectural origins of this tomb. Some suggest it imitates the tower tombs of Urartu. Others link it to the stone building traditions of Lydia, and still others point out that the stepped base may derive from the ziggurat tradition of Mesopotamia. No single origin hypothesis has gained consensus in academia, and it is likely that much like the overall style of Pasargadae, this structure represents an intentional fusion of multiple traditions. This architectural restraint may reflect an important characteristic of early Persian kingship, an attempt to display authority while avoiding excessive opulence, so as not to provoke resentment among the conquered peoples. The relative simplicity of the tomb may also be related to Persian religious beliefs, as Zoroastrian tradition emphasizes spiritual purity over material extravagance. The most famous associated narrative of this tomb comes from the period of Alexander the Great's Eastern campaign. According to Arrian, during his return from India in 324 BCE, Alexander visited Pasargadae and ordered his general Aristobulus to enter the burial chamber. Inside, Aristobulus reportedly saw a golden couch, a table covered with a tapestry, several drinking vessels, and the body of Cyrus resting in a sarcophagus. At the entrance of the chamber, an inscription was said to be carved, which Arrian paraphrased as, "O man, I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians and was king of Asia. Do not grudge me this monument." The wording of this inscription varies among ancient authors. Strabo's version differs slightly from Arrian's, while Plutarch's citation presents another variation. No existing archaeological evidence confirms that this inscription was ever actually present on the tomb, as no traces of engraving have been found on the exterior walls to this day. It may have existed and eroded over time, or it may have been a later literary embellishment from the start. Regardless of its authenticity, these words have become one of the most enduring cultural symbols associated with Cyrus. The content of the inscription itself is rich in rhetorical skill. It speaks directly from the deceased to the living, displaying achievement while expressing humility, asserting identity while acknowledging the equality of death. This complex rhetorical structure resembles the products of Hellenistic literature more than the style of a 6th century BCE Persian inscription. Arrian also recorded a detail that angered Alexander. When Aristobulus entered the burial chamber, he found that the tomb had been looted, the golden couch was damaged, Some of the burial items were missing, and Cyrus's remains had been disturbed. Alexander ordered an investigation into the tomb robbers and the restoration of the tomb. If this account is true, it indicates that within less than 200 years after Cyrus's death, the security of the tomb could no longer be guaranteed. However, we must also note that Arrian wrote more than 400 years after Alexander's eastern campaign, relying on the records of military historians such as Aristobulus and Ptolemy, which themselves had undergone multiple transcriptions and edits. Alexander's act of restoring Cyrus's tomb can be interpreted on a political level as a deliberate gesture, a conqueror paying tribute to the founder of the conquered empire, thereby declaring himself a legitimate successor rather than a mere destroyer. The line between historical fact and political performance is equally blurred in this scenario. Alexander's anger toward the tomb robbers may have been genuine, but the expression of this anger and its political intent were clearly carefully calculated. By restoring Cyrus's tomb, Alexander conveyed an important message to the Persian nobility and people. He respected Persian historical traditions and was willing to take on the responsibility of protecting them. This gesture helped alleviate the hostility of the conquered people and provided cultural support for the legitimacy of Macedonian rule. Over the long centuries that followed, the tomb of Pasargadae underwent multiple transformations in identity. After the Islamic conquest, local tradition renamed the structure the Tomb of Solomon's Mother, integrating it into the narrative framework of Islamic culture. This renaming likely protected it from destruction. As a sacred site associated with prophetic tradition, it gained a form of religious immunity. It was not until modern European travelers and archaeologists arrived in the province of Fars that the building was re-identified as the Tomb of Cyrus. This process of identification was not without controversy, relying primarily on comparisons between classical descriptions of the tomb's location and form and the physical structure itself, rather than any inscriptions or direct archaeological evidence. What we refer to today as the Tomb of Cyrus is, strictly speaking, a highly probable, but not yet definitively confirmed attribution, lacking conclusive epigraphic evidence. These shifts in identity reflect the complexity of historical memory. The same structure can carry entirely different meanings and values across different cultural contexts. The renaming during the Islamic period was not merely a misunderstanding, but a strategy of cultural adaptation, allowing the ancient building to endure within a new religious and political environment. Similarly, the re-identification by modern archaeology carries its own cultural and political undertones, reflecting the reinterpretation and utilization of ancient historical heritage by modern nation-states. The death and burial of Cyrus ultimately bring us back to a central question that runs through this series. Where do the boundaries of our knowledge lie regarding this empire builder? The three conflicting narratives of his death cannot be independently verified. The attribution of the tomb is highly probable, but lacks epigraphic confirmation, and the most famous epitaph may never have been carved in stone. Yet, it is precisely these uncertainties that constitute the true nature of Cyrus as a historical figure. Not an individual who can be fully reconstructed, but a name layered with multiple narratives. The stone tomb at Pasargadae stands silently on the plains of Fars, answering no questions, but posing a fundamental one through its enduring presence. When all texts carry biases and all memories are filtered, how can we trust what we believe we know about the past? This question will not be answered in the next chapter, but it will accompany us into the final discussion: how each era, from ancient to contemporary times, has reshaped the image of Cyrus according to its own needs. This continuous process of reinvention is itself part of history, reminding us that the true face of a historical figure often lies not in what we can definitively know, but in how we grapple with the uncertainties. The narratives of Cyrus's death matter, not only because they attempt to record a historical event, but also because they reveal how humanity uses storytelling to understand the complex relationships between power, death, and memory. In early 4th century BC Athens, a veteran who had once followed Cyrus the Younger on his expedition deep into Persia sat in his study, writing a work not about the Cyrus he had personally known. Xenophon's subject was the empire builder from 2 centuries earlier, Cyrus the Great, yet the figure he portrayed was less a restoration of the historical personage and more a meticulously polished mirror reflecting all of Xenophon's own expectations of an ideal ruler. From its very first page, the work later known as the Phaseropedia diverged from the narrative framework established by Herodotus. There was no legend of an abandoned infant, no upbringing by shepherds. Instead, it presented a young Persian noble systematically educated from childhood, growing up in virtue and discipline. What Xenophon needed was not a legendary hero chosen by fate, but a model of governance shaped by education. This choice itself revealed his intent. After the Athenian democracy had been devastated by the Peloponnesian War and following the execution of Socrates, Xenophon's faith in Greek state politics had wavered. He needed to look beyond the Greek world for an alternative political vision. Cyrus the Great, a name sufficiently distant, yet sufficiently great, offered an ideal canvas. In Xenophon's conception, the Persian Empire became a vast laboratory to test the Socratic school's philosophical propositions on the relationship between virtue and power. His Cyrus was not only to conquer lands, but also to win hearts. Not only to build an empire, but also to demonstrate the possibility of just rule. This writing strategy endowed the Phaseropedia from the outset with an ambition that transcended historical record. It was to become a textbook of political philosophy. The education of Cyrus is not a historical work in the strict sense. The list of qualities Xenophon attributes to Cyrus: temperance, generosity, attentiveness, and the ability to inspire loyalty in his followers closely mirrors the Socratic definition of a good leader. In the book, Cyrus never succumbs to rage or indiscriminate killing. He maintains power through persuasion, rather than fear, and strengthens alliances by sharing spoils, rather than monopolizing them. How far do these depictions diverge from the historical Cyrus we encountered in earlier chapters? The answer is that the distance cannot be precisely measured, as we lack sufficient Persian sources to establish an independent frame of reference. However, one thing is certain: Xenophon deliberately omitted the harsh, brutal, or ambiguous aspects of Cyrus's story as recorded by Herodotus. The disastrous defeat and death in the battle against the Massagetae are replaced in the education of Cyrus with a serene deathbed scene. Cyrus delivering his final instructions to his sons before passing away peacefully. This is not historical record, but a parable of political philosophy. More importantly, Xenophon removed all elements from Cyrus's life that could not be explained by reason, oracles, prophecies, and dreams. Supernatural factors that play a significant role in Herodotus's narrative are entirely absent in the education of Cyrus. In their place is a thoroughly secular logic of success. Proper education cultivates proper character. Proper character leads to sound decisions, and sound decisions bring political success. The very simplicity and clarity of this causal chain reveal its artificiality. However, it was precisely this work, which deviated from historical facts, that established the fundamental image of Cyrus in the Western world. For the next 2 millennia, Xenophon's text was widely copied during the Hellenistic period, and the political elites of the late Roman Republic regarded it as a manual on leadership. It is recorded that Cicero held this work in high esteem, and Scipio Aemilianus was said to have carried it with him. Here, a methodological pause is necessary when tracing the dissemination of Cyrus's image. What we follow is not the transmission of historical facts, but the reception history of a literary text. Each generation of readers saw in Xenophon's Cyrus the most pressing political anxieties of their own time. The Romans read it as a longing for a good emperor during the transition from the Republic to the Empire. While Xenophon originally intended to address the governance dilemmas following the failure of Athenian democracy, the same text carried entirely different political projections. This phenomenon is not uncommon in the study of intellectual history. But what makes the case of Cyrus unique is that, due to the lack of native Persian Empire documents, Xenophon's version almost became the sole window through which the Western world understood Cyrus. The political imagination of a Greek philosopher was thus mistaken for the true record of Persian history. When Machiavelli mentioned Cyrus in Faith of Prince Fay, he still referenced Xenophon's account when Bacon discussed imperial governance. His model of Persia still derived from Phaseropedia Fay. The boundary between history and literature was completely blurred in the process of transmission. Beyond Xenophon, another line of transmission for the image of Cyrus comes from the Hebrew Bible. As discussed in chapter 7, the books of Ezra and Isaiah depict Cyrus as an instrument chosen by God, a foreign king who liberated the Babylonian exiles and ordered the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. This narrative grants Cyrus a unique theological status in Jewish tradition. He is not a believer, yet he is an executor of faith. With the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, this image was incorporated into a grander narrative of salvation history. Early church fathers occasionally cited Cyrus as an example of God's ability to use pagan rulers to fulfill divine plans. Notably, the Cyrus of the biblical tradition and the Cyrus portrayed by Xenophon have almost no overlap. The former is a passive vessel of divine will, while the latter is an active exemplar of human virtue. These two lines of transmission operated independently within their respective cultural spheres for nearly 1500 years, only converging in the vision of European intellectuals during the Renaissance. More interestingly, the Christian tradition's memory of Cyrus maintained a peculiar selectivity. They remembered his act of liberating the Jews, but completely overlooked his similar policies toward the religions of other peoples. In Christian historiography, Cyrus's religious tolerance was particularized as special favor toward the chosen people, rather than a universal principle of governance. This interpretation persisted into the modern era and only began to be systematically questioned and revised during the Enlightenment. In Persia itself, the memory of Cyrus followed a distinctly different path. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, successive regime changes, Alexander's conquest, the Hellenistic rule of the Seleucid dynasty, and the rise of the Parthian Empire gradually obscured Cyrus's name in native Persian records. In the Persian king lists and epic traditions compiled during the Sasanian period, Cyrus's place was taken by a semi-mythical figure named Khosrow. A correspondence debated among scholars, with some arguing that Khosrow blended traits of multiple Achaemenid rulers rather than directly representing Cyrus. By the time Ferdowsi completed the Shahnameh at the end of the 10th century, Cyrus, as a recognizable historical individual, had nearly vanished from Persian literary tradition. The tomb at Pasargadae still stood, but local inhabitants had long forgotten who was buried there. Arab geographers recorded that, during the Islamic era, the tomb was known as the Tomb of Solomon's Mother. Thus, the name of an empire builder was forgotten in his own land for nearly a millennium. This forgetting was no accident. It reflected the systematic reconstruction of pre-Islamic history within Persian culture during its Islamization. Under the new religious framework, the Achaemenid dynasty was repositioned as a relic of the Age of Ignorance. Its historical value greatly diminished. It was only in the 19th century with the rise of European Oriental studies and renewed scholarly interest in ancient Persian history, that Cyrus's name resurfaced in his homeland. Cyrus's second resurrection in Europe occurred during the Enlightenment, from the late 17th to the 18th century, as European thinkers began systematically questioning absolute monarchy and religious intolerance. They needed historical precedents to support their arguments. Cyrus, more precisely the Xenophon version of Cyrus, perfectly met this need. When discussing religious tolerance, Locke cited the Persian Empire's respect for the beliefs of conquered peoples as a positive example. In Faith the Spirit of the Laws Fey, Montesquieu drew a limited distinction between the governance model of the Persian Empire and the stereotypes of Eastern despotism, with Cyrus playing the role of an enlightened conqueror. Voltaire was even more direct, portraying Cyrus in several works as an ancient exemplar of religious tolerance, contrasting him with the history of religious persecution in the Christian world of Europe. However, these references shared a common methodological issue. The Enlightenment thinkers relied almost entirely on Greek texts and were unaware of Near Eastern primary sources, like the Cyrus cylinder. Cuneiform script was not successfully deciphered until the mid-19th century. What they invoked was a literary image filtered through Xenophon and amplified by Roman tradition, rather than a historical judgment based on diverse sources. Ironically, the tolerant Cyrus cited by Enlightenment thinkers in their critique of European despotism was itself a construct of Greek literature. They used an ancient literary imagination to criticize contemporary political systems, without realizing the fictional nature of that imagination. This methodological blind spot was not gradually revealed until the rise of archaeology in the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, the decipherment of cuneiform script opened a new window for the study of Cyrus. In 1879, Assyriologist Hormuzd Rassam excavated the Cyrus cylinder at the ruins of Babylon. This Akkadian inscription allowed modern scholars for the first time to bypass Greek intermediaries and directly engage with the political discourse of the Persian Empire itself. The content of the cylinder has been detailed in Chapter 5. Here, the focus is on the interpretive controversies it sparked after its discovery. Early Assyriologists tended to interpret the cylinder as an ancient precursor to a declaration of human rights, an interpretation that gained significant political momentum in the mid-20th century. However, starting in the 1980s, a growing number of scholars pointed out that the text's format, rhetorical strategies, and theological framework align entirely with the traditional paradigms of Mesopotamian royal inscriptions. What it expresses is not a modern concept of rights, but rather a standard proclamation of legitimacy by a Near Eastern conqueror. This academic debate remains unresolved to this day. Yet, it reveals a deeper issue. Each generation's interpretation of the Cyrus cylinder is inevitably shaped by the concerns of its own era. Scholars in the 19th century read in it the seeds of national self-determination. Mid-20th century scholars saw the early echoes of human rights ideals, while contemporary scholars focus more on its functional attributes as a piece of political propaganda. The same document, in different historical contexts, reveals entirely different layers of meaning, which itself demonstrates the epochal nature of historical interpretation. The pivotal moment that brought the Cyrus cylinder to global public attention was the 2500th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Persian Empire, held by Iran's Pahlavi dynasty in 1971. King Mohammad Reza Pahlavi chose Pasargadae, the site of Cyrus's tomb, as the central location for the festivities, and delivered the famous address, "Cyrus, rest in peace, for we are awake." This extravagant celebration, which invited dozens of world leaders, featured a luxurious tent city erected on the plains of Pasargadae, with French master chefs overseeing the banquets and extensive coverage by global media. The Pahlavi regime's intention was clear: to establish a direct symbolic lineage with Cyrus, thereby seeking historical roots for a modern monarchy facing a domestic legitimacy crisis. In this context, the Cyrus cylinder was repackaged as the world's first charter of human rights, with replicas gifted to the United Nations. This characterization has sparked ongoing criticism in academic circles. Yet, it proved highly successful in political communication, introducing Cyrus to the global public consciousness for the first time as a pioneer of human rights. The Pahlavi strategy exemplifies a typical model for constructing historical legitimacy in modern nation-states, selectively invoking ancient symbols, reinterpreting them as precursors to modern values, and thereby providing historical support for the legitimacy of contemporary regimes. This approach was widespread during the 20th century wave of decolonization, with Cyrus being just one of many ancient monarchs modernized. In this way, however, the Pahlavi narrative of Cyrus underwent a dramatic reversal after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The new regime viewed the previous dynasty's reverence for Achaemenid heritage as a betrayal of Islamic identity by secular nationalism, and the Pasargadae celebrations were reinterpreted as symbols of a corrupt dynasty's extravagance. In the first decade after the revolution, Cyrus's name almost disappeared from Iran's official discourse. Yet, the workings of historical memory are far more complex than regime changes. Entering the 21st century, Cyrus experienced a grassroots revival in Iranian civil society. Each October, tens of thousands of Iranians spontaneously gather at the tomb of Cyrus in Pasargadae. This act has been interpreted by some observers as a silent protest against the Islamic Republic's official narrative, while others see it as an expression of cultural identity transcending political stances. Cyrus's image in contemporary Iranian society has become a contested symbol. Secular nationalists, overseas exile communities, reformist intellectuals, and even some conservative figures all seek to incorporate him into their respective narrative frameworks. A historical figure from 2,500 years ago remains an active political issue in his own land. This phenomenon reflects the deep-seated tension in modern Iranian society between religious and national identity. There exists a structural conflict between the Persian civilization tradition, represented by Cyrus, and the religious value system emphasized by the Islamic Revolution, which is difficult to reconcile. The annual gathering at Pasargadae is in fact a symbolic expression of this conflict in public space. Outside of Iran, the contemporary image of Cyrus continues to undergo constant reshaping. In 2010, the Cyrus cylinder was presented as a symbol of tolerance in the ancient world, in a special exhibition at the British Museum, followed by a tour across several cities in the United States, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors. At the same time, academic efforts to demythologize the cylinder have accelerated. Increasingly, studies place it within the comparative framework of Neo-Babylonian royal inscriptions, and emphasizing its role as political propaganda rather than as a pioneer of human rights. These two trends operate in parallel. Cyrus grows ever greater in public dissemination, while becoming increasingly complex in academic research. Questions such as the price paid by ordinary soldiers in his conquests, or whether the common people in conquered regions truly experienced the so-called tolerance find almost no direct answers in existing historical records. What we possess are always texts from an elite perspective. Whether the narratives of Greek historians, the inscriptions of Babylonian priests, or the official proclamations of the Persian court. This structural limitation of historical sources means that any discussion of Cyrus's true face must confront a fundamental epistemological dilemma. We can never fully escape the framework of elite narratives to access the real experiences of the conquered and the ruled. The tolerant Cyrus displayed in modern museum exhibitions remains, to a large extent, a continuation of rulers' self-promotion, merely wrapped in the language of contemporary human rights discourse. This brings us back to a core question that runs throughout the series. To what extent do we truly know Cyrus? Looking back at the narrative of the previous 9 chapters, every key moment is accompanied by missing or contradictory historical sources. His birth is shrouded in legend. His defeat of the Medes relies on a single Greek historical source. The decade of his conquest of Central Asia is nearly a blank. The peaceful nature of his entry into Babylon comes from the victor's own narrative. His religious stance presents 3 different faces across 3 incompatible literary traditions, and his death has 3 contradictory versions. Between these fragments, the work of historians is not to piece together a complete portrait, but to honestly annotate the source, material, and possible distortions of each fragment. Perhaps this is the most honest stance in Cyrus studies, and indeed in all ancient history research. Not to proclaim we know who he was, but to precisely state where our ignorance begins. This epistemological humility does not diminish the value of historical research. On the contrary, it demands that we apply stricter standards to distinguish the reliability levels of historical sources and more clearly define the scope of applicability for different types of evidence. When we acknowledge the constructed nature of Cyrus's image, we are actually laying the groundwork for more precise historical understanding. Only when we fully recognize the limitations of each historical source can we, within the boundaries of these limitations, come as close as possible to the true state of history. The stone tomb at Pasargadae still stands on the plateau of Iran's Fars province. 6 tiers of steps support a simple burial chamber, devoid of reliefs, inscriptions, or any text to inform visitors that the person interred within once conquered vast lands stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Darya. The silence of this structure may be closer to the true state of history than any written record. It reminds us that all grand narratives of Cyrus, whether Xenophon's ideal monarch, the anointed one in the Bible, the Enlightenment thinker's pioneer of tolerance, or the Pahlavi dynasty's national symbol, are projections of later generations. Stones do not speak, we do. And every time we speak, we reshape the person we claim to restore. The value of historiography may not lie in ultimately presenting a definitive Cyrus, but in making each generation aware of how much of the Cyrus they see is the man himself, and how much is themselves. This reflective historical consciousness requires us to maintain a dual clarity when confronting any historical figure striving to approach historical truth, while remaining vigilant against the biases of our own time. In this sense, the history of Cyrus's image is not only a record of how an ancient monarch has been received, but also a mirror reflecting the evolution of human historical consciousness. Each generation's reinterpretation of Cyrus reveals their understanding of core political values such as power, justice, and tolerance. The trajectory of this evolving understanding itself constitutes a significant part of intellectual history.